Chapter 10. As the leopard leaped for the great ape, Miriam gasped in surprise and horror, not for the impending fate of the anthropoid, but at the act of the youth who but an instant before had angrily struck his strange companion. For scarce had the carnivore burst into view than with drawn knife the youth had leaped far out above him, so that as Shieta was almost in the act of sinking fangs and talons in Akut's broad back, the killer landed full upon the leopard's shoulders. The cat halted in midair, missed the ape by but a hair's breadth, and with horrid snarlings rolled over upon its back, clutching and clawing in an effort to reach and dislodge the antagonist, biting at its neck and knifing it in the side. Akut, startled by the sudden rush from his rear, and following hoary instinct, was in the tree beside the girl with an agility little short of marvelous in so heavy a beast. But the moment that he turned to see what was going on below him brought him as quickly to the ground again. Personal differences were quickly forgotten in the danger which menaced his human companion, nor was he a whit less eager to jeopardize his own safety in the service of his friend than Korak had been to succor him. The result was that Shieta presently found two ferocious creatures tearing him to ribbons. Shrieking, snarling and growling, the three rolled hither and thither among the underbrush, while with staring eyes the sole spectator of the battle royal crouched trembling in the tree above them, hugging Geeka frantically to her breast. It was the boy's knife which eventually decided the battle, and as the fierce feline shuddered convulsively and rolled over upon its side, the youth and the ape rose and faced one another across the prostrate carcass. Korak jerked his head in the direction of the little girl in the tree. "Leave her alone," he said, "she is mine." Akut grunted, blinked his bloodshot eyes, and turned toward the body of Shieta. Standing erect upon it, he threw out his great chest, raised his face toward the heavens and gave voice to so horrid a scream that once again the little girl shuddered and shrank. It was the victory cry of the bull ape that has made a kill. The boy only looked on for a moment in silence, then he leaped into the tree again to the girl's side. Akut presently rejoined them. For a few minutes he busied himself licking his wounds, then he wandered off to hunt his breakfast. For many months the strange life of the three went on unmarked by any unusual occurrences. At least without any occurrences that seemed unusual to the youth or the ape, but to the little girl it was a constant nightmare of horrors for days and weeks, until she too became accustomed to gazing into the eyeless sockets of death and to the feel of the icy wind of his shroud-like mantle. Slowly she learned the rudiments of the only common medium of thought exchange which her companions possessed, the language of the great apes. More quickly she perfected herself in jungle craft, so that the time soon came when she was an important factor in the chase, watching while the others slept, or helping them to trace the spoor of whatever prey they might be stalking. Akut accepted her on a footing which bordered upon equality when it was necessary for them to come into close contact, but for the most part he avoided her. The youth always was kind to her, and if there were many occasions upon which he felt the burden of her presence he hid it from her. Finding that the night damp and chill caused her discomfort and even suffering, Korak constructed a tight little shelter high among the swaying branches of a giant tree. Here little Miriam slept in comparative warmth and safety, while the killer and the ape perched upon nearby branches, the former always before the entrance to the lofty domicile, where he best could guard its inmate from the dangers of arboreal enemies. They were too high to feel much fear of Shieta, but there was always Hista, the snake, to strike terror to one's soul, and the great baboons who lived nearby, and who, while never attacking, always bared their fangs and barked at any of the trio when they passed near them. After the construction of the shelter, the activities of the three became localized. They ranged less widely, for there was always the necessity of returning to their own tree at nightfall. A river flowed nearby. Game and fruit were plentiful, as were fish also. Existence had settled down to the daily humdrum of the wild, the search for food and the sleeping upon full bellies. They looked no further ahead than today. If the youth thought of his past and of those who longed for him in the distant metropolis, it was in a detached and impersonal sort of way, as though that other life belonged to another creature than himself. He had given up hope of returning to civilization, for since his various rebuffs at the hands of those to whom he had looked for friendship, he had wandered so far inland as to realize that he was completely lost in the mazes of the jungle. Then, too, Since the coming of Miriam he had found in her that one thing which he had most missed before in his savage, jungle life, human companionship. In his friendship for her there was appreciable no trace of sex influence of which he was cognizant. They were friends, companions, that was all. Both might have been boys, except for the half-tender and always masterful manifestation of the protective instinct which was apparent in Korak's attitude. The little girl idolized him as she might have idolized an indulgent brother had she had one. Love was a thing unknown to either, but as the youth neared manhood it was inevitable that it should come to him as it did to every other savage, jungle male. As Miriam became proficient in their common language the pleasures of their companionship grew correspondingly, for now they could converse and aided by the mental powers of their human heritage they amplified the restricted vocabulary of the apes until talking was transformed from a task into an enjoyable pastime. When Korak hunted, Miriam usually accompanied him, for she had learned the fine art of silence, when silence was desirable. She could pass through the branches of the great trees now with all the agility and stealth of the killer himself. Great heights no longer appalled her. She swung from limb to limb, or she raced through the mighty branches, sure-footed, lithe, and fearless. Korak was very proud of her, and even old Akut grunted in approval where before he had growled in contempt. A distant village of blacks had furnished her with a mantle of fur and feathers, with copper ornaments, and weapons, for Korak would not permit her to go unarmed, or unversed in the use of the weapons he stole for her. A leather thong over one shoulder supported the ever-present Geeka who was still the recipient of her most sacred confidences. A light spear and a long knife were her weapons of offense or defense. Her body, rounding into the fullness of an early maturity, followed the lines of a Greek goddess, but there the similarity ceased, for her face was beautiful. As she grew more accustomed to the jungle and the ways of its wild denizens fear left her. As time wore on she even hunted alone when Korak and Akut were prowling at a great distance, as they were sometimes forced to do when game was scarce in their immediate vicinity. Upon these occasions she usually confined her endeavors to the smaller animals though sometimes she brought down a deer, and once even Horta, the boar a great tusker that even Shieta might have thought twice before attacking. In their stamping grounds in the jungle the three were familiar figures. The little monkeys knew them well, often coming close to chatter and frolic about them. When Akut was by, the small folk kept their distance, but with Korak they were less shy and when both the males were gone they would come close to Miriam, tugging at her ornaments or playing with Geeka, who was a never-ending source of amusement to them. The girl played with them and fed them, and when she was alone they helped her to pass the long hours until Korak's return. Nor were they worthless as friends. In the hunt they helped her locate her quarry. Often they would come racing through the trees to her side to announce the near presence of antelope or giraffe, or with excited warnings of the proximity of Shieta or Numa. Luscious, sun-kissed fruits which hung far out upon the frail bough of the jungle's waving crest were brought to her by these tiny, nimble allies. Sometimes they played tricks upon her, but she was always kind and gentle with them and in their wild, half-human way they were kind to her and affectionate. Their language being similar to that of the great apes Miriam could converse with them though the poverty of their vocabulary rendered these exchanges anything but feasts of reason. For familiar objects they had names, as well as for those conditions which induced pain or pleasure, joy, sorrow, or rage. These root words were so similar to those in use among the great anthropoids as to suggest that the language of the Manus was the mother tongue. At best it lent itself to but material and sordid exchange. Dreams, aspirations, hopes, the past, the future held no place in the conversation of Manu, the monkey. All was of the present, particularly of filling his belly and catching lice. Poor food was this to nourish the mental appetite of a girl just upon the brink of womanhood. And so, finding Mana only amusing as an occasional playfellow or pet, Miriam poured out her sweetest soul thoughts into the deaf ears of Geeka's ivory head. To Geeka she spoke in Arabic, knowing that Geeka, being but a doll, could not understand the language of Korak and Akut, and that the language of Korak and Akut being that of male apes contained nothing of interest to an Arab doll. Geeka had undergone a transformation since her little mother had left the village of the Shek. Her garmenture now reflected in miniature that of Miriam. A tiny bit of leopard skin covered her rat-skin torso from shoulder to splinter knee. A band of braided grasses about her brow held in place a few gaudy feathers from the parakeet, while other bits of grass were fashioned into imitations of arm and leg ornaments of metal. Geeka was a perfect little savage, but at heart she was unchanged, being the same omnivorous listener as of yore. An excellent trait in Geeka was that she never interrupted in order to talk about herself. Today was no exception. She had been listening attentively to Miriam for an hour, propped against the bole of a tree while her lithe, young mistress stretched cat-like and luxurious along a swaying branch before her. "Little Geeka," said Miriam, "our Korak has been gone for a long time today. We miss him, little Geeka, do we not? It is dull and lonesome in the great jungle when our Korak is away. What will he bring us this time, eh? Another shining band of metal for Miriam's ankle? Or a soft, doeskin loincloth from the body of a black she? He tells me that it is harder to get the possessions of the shes, for he will not kill them as he does the males, and they fight savagely when he leaps upon them to wrest their ornaments from them. Then come the males with spears and arrows and Korak takes to the trees. Sometimes he takes the she with him and high among the branches divests her of the things he wishes to bring home to Miriam. He says that the blacks fear him now, and at first sight of him the women and children run shrieking to their huts, but he follows them within, and it is not often that he returns without arrows for himself and a present for Miriam. Korak is mighty among the jungle people, our Korak, Geeka no, my Korak." Miriam's conversation was interrupted by the sudden plunge of an excited little monkey that landed upon her shoulders in a flying leap from a neighboring tree. "Climb," he cried. "Climb! The Mangani are coming." Miriam glanced lazily over her shoulder at the excited disturber of her peace. "Climb, yourself, little Manu," she said. "The only Mangani in our jungle are Korak and Akat. It is they you have seen returning from the hunt. Someday you will see your own shadow, little Manu, and then you will be frightened to death." But the monkey only screamed his warning more lustily before he raced upward toward the safety of the high terrace where Mangani, the great ape, could not follow. Presently Miriam heard the sound of approaching bodies swinging through the trees. She listened attentively. There were two, and they were great apes, Korak and Akat. To her Korak was an ape, a Mangani, for as such the three always described themselves. Man was an enemy, so they did not think of themselves as belonging any longer to the same genus. Tumangani, or great white ape, which described the white man in their language, did not fit them all. Gomangani, great black ape, or Negro, described none of them, so they called themselves plain Mangani. Miriam decided that she would feign slumber and play a joke on Korak. So she lay very still with eyes tightly closed. She heard the two approaching closer and closer. They were in the adjoining tree now and must have discovered her, for they had halted. Why were they so quiet? Why did not Korak call out his customary greeting? The quietness was ominous. It was followed presently by a very stealthy sound. One of them was creeping upon her. Was Korak planning a joke upon his own account? Well, she would fool him. Cautiously she opened her eyes the tiniest bit, and as she did so her heart stood still. Creeping silently toward her was a huge bull ape that she never before had seen. Behind him was another like him. With the agility of a squirrel Miriam was upon her feet, and at the same instant the great bull lunged for her. Leaping from limb to limb the girl fled through the jungle while close behind her came the two great apes. Above them raced a bevy of screaming, chattering monkeys, hurling taunts and insults at the Mangani, and encouragement and advice to the girl. From tree to tree swung Miriam, working ever upward toward the smaller branches which would not bear the weight of her pursuers. Faster and faster came the bull apes after her. The clutching fingers of the foremost were almost upon her again and again, but she eluded them by sudden bursts of speed or reckless chances as she threw herself across dizzy spaces. Slowly she was gaining her way to the greater heights where safety lay, when, after a particularly daring leap, the swaying branch she grasped bent low beneath her weight, nor whipped upward again as it should have done. Even before the rending sound which followed, Miriam knew that she had misjudged the strength of the limb. It gave slowly at first. Then there was a ripping as it parted from the trunk. Releasing her hold, Miriam dropped among the foliage beneath, clutching for a new support. She found it a dozen feet below the broken limb. She had fallen thus many times before, so that she had no particular terror of a fall. It was the delay which appalled her most, and rightly, for scarce had she scrambled to a place of safety than the body of the huge ape dropped at her side and a great, hairy arm went about her waist. Almost at once the other ape reached his companion's side. He made a lunge at Miriam, but her captor swung her to one side, bared his fighting fangs and growled ominously. Miriam struggled to escape. She struck at the hairy breast and bearded cheek. She fastened her strong, white teeth in one shaggy forearm. The ape cuffed her viciously across the face, then he had to turn his attention to his fellow who quite evidently desired the prize for his own. The captor could not fight to advantage upon the swaying bough, burdened as he was by a squirming, struggling captive, so he dropped quickly to the ground beneath. The other followed him, and here they fought, occasionally abandoning their duel to pursue and recapture the girl who took every advantage of her captor's preoccupation in battle to break away in attempted escape, but always they overtook her, and first one and then the other possessed her as they struggled to tear one another to pieces for the prize. Often the girl came in for many blows that were intended for a hairy foe, and once she was felled, lying unconscious while the apes, relieved of the distraction of detaining her by force, tore into one another in fierce and terrible combat. Above them screamed the little monkeys, racing hither and thither in a frenzy of hysterical excitement. Back and forth over the battlefield flew countless birds of gorgeous plumage, squawking their hoarse cries of rage and defiance. In the distance a lion roared. The larger bull was slowly tearing his antagonist to pieces. They rolled upon the ground, biting and striking. Again, erect upon their hind legs, they pulled and tugged like human wrestlers, but always the giant fangs found their bloody part to play until both combatants and the ground about them were red with gore. Miriam, through it all, lay still and unconscious upon the ground. At last one found a permanent hold upon the jugular of the other, and thus they went down for the last time. For several minutes they lay with scarce a struggle. It was the larger bull who arose alone from the last embrace. He shook himself. A deep growl rumbled from his hairy throat. He waddled back and forth between the body of the girl and that of his vanquished foe. Then he stood upon the latter and gave tongue to his hideous challenge. The little monkeys broke, screaming, in all directions as the terrifying noise broke upon their ears. The gorgeous birds took wing and fled. Once again the lion roared, this time at a greater distance. The great ape waddled once more to the girl's side. He turned her over upon her back, and stooping commenced to sniff and listen about her face and breast. She lived. The monkeys were returning. They came in swarms, and from above hurled down insults upon the victor. The ape showed his displeasure by baring his teeth and growling up at them. Then he stooped and lifting the girl to his shoulder waddled off through the jungle. In his wake followed the angry mob. Chapter 11. Korak, returning from the hunt, heard the jabbering of the excited monkeys. He knew that something was seriously amiss. Hister, the snake, had doubtless coiled his slimy folds about some careless Manu. The youth hastened ahead. The monkeys were Miriam's friends. He would help them if he could. He traveled rapidly along the middle terrace. In the tree by Miriam's shelter he deposited his trophies of the hunt and called aloud to her. There was no answer. He dropped quickly to a lower level. She might be hiding from him. Upon a great branch where Miriam often swung at indolent ease he saw Geeka propped against the tree's great bole. What could it mean? Miriam had never left Geeka thus alone before. Korak picked up the doll and tucked it in his belt. He called again, more loudly, but no Miriam answered his summons. In the distance the jabbering of the excited Manus was growing less distinct. Could their excitement be in any way connected with Miriam's disappearance? The bare thought was enough. Without waiting for Akut, who was coming slowly along some distance in his rear, Korak swung rapidly in the direction of the chattering mob. But a few minutes sufficed to overtake the rearmost. At sight of him they fell to screaming and pointing downward ahead of them, and a moment later Korak came within sight of the cause of their rage. The youth's heart stood still in terror as he saw the limp body of the girl across the hairy shoulders of a great ape. That she was dead he did not doubt, and in that instant there arose within him a something which he did not try to interpret nor could have had he tried, but all at once the whole world seemed centered in that tender, graceful body, that frail little body, hanging so pitifully limp and helpless across the bulging shoulders of the brute. He knew then that little Miriam was his world, his sun, his moon, his stars. With her going had gone all light and warmth and happiness. A groan escaped his lips, and after that a series of hideous roars, more bestial than the beasts, as he dropped plummet-like in mad descent toward the perpetrator of this hideous crime. The bull ape turned at the first note of this new and menacing voice, and as he turned a new flame was added to the rage and hatred of the killer, for he saw that the creature before him was none other than the king ape which had driven him away from the great anthropoids to whom he had looked for friendship and asylum. Dropping the body of the girl to the ground, the bull turned to battle anew for possession of his expensive prize, but this time he looked for an easy conquest. He too recognized Korak. Had he not chased him away from the amphitheater without even having to lay a fang or paw upon him? With lowered head and bulging shoulders he rushed headlong for the smooth-skinned creature who was daring to question his right to his prey. They met head-on like two charging bulls, to go down together tearing and striking. Korak forgot his knife. Rage and bloodlust such as his could be satisfied only by the feel of hot flesh between rending fangs, by the gush of new life blood against his bare skin, for, though he did not realize it, Korak, the killer, was fighting for something more compelling than hate or revenge. He was a great male fighting another male for a she of his own kind. So impetuous was the attack of the man-ape that he found his hold before the anthropoid could prevent him, a savage hold, with strong jaws closed upon a pulsing jugular, and there he clung, with closed eyes, while his fingers sought another hold upon the shaggy throat. It was then that Miriam opened her eyes. At the sight before her they went wide. "Korak," she cried. "Korak! My Korak! I knew that you would come. Kill him, Korak! Kill him!" And with flashing eyes and heaving bosom the girl, coming to her feet, ran to Korak's side to encourage him. Nearby lay the killer's spear, where he had flung it as he charged the ape. The girl saw it and snatched it up. No faintness overcame her in the face of this battle primeval at her feet. For her there was no hysterical reaction from the nerve strain of her own personal encounter with the bull. She was excited, but cool and entirely unafraid. Her Korak was battling with another Mangani that would have stolen her, but she did not seek the safety of an overhanging bough there to watch the battle from afar, as would a she-Mangani. Instead she placed the point of Korak's spear against the bull ape's side and plunged the sharp point deep into the savage heart. Korak had not needed her aid, for the great bull had been already as good as dead, with the blood gushing from his torn jugular, but Korak rose smiling with a word of approbation for his helper. How tall and fine she was! Had she changed suddenly within the few hours of his absence, or had his battle with the ape affected his vision? He might have been looking at Miriam through new eyes for the many startling and wonderful surprises his gaze revealed. How long it had been since he had found her in her father's village, a little Arab girl, he did not know, for time is of no import in the jungle and so he had kept no track of the passing days. But he realized, as he looked upon her now, that she was no longer such a little girl as he had first seen playing with Geeka beneath the great tree just within the palisade. The change must have been very gradual to have eluded his notice until now. And what was it that had caused him to realize it so suddenly? His gaze wandered from the girl to the body of the dead bull. For the first time there flashed to his understanding the explanation of the reason for the girl's attempted abduction. Korak's eyes went wide and then they closed to narrow slits of rage as he stood glaring down upon the abysmal brute at his feet. When next his glance rose to Miriam's face, a slow flush suffused his own. Now, indeed, was he looking upon her through new eyes, the eyes of a man looking upon a maid. Akat had come up just as Miriam had speared Korak's antagonist. The exultation of the old ape was keen. He strutted, stiff-legged and truculent about the body of the fallen enemy. He growled and upcurved his long, flexible lip. His hair bristled. He was paying no attention to Miriam and Korak. Back in the uttermost recesses of his little brain something was stirring, something which the sight and smell of the great bull had aroused. The outward manifestation of the germinating idea was one of bestial rage, but the inner sensations were pleasurable in the extreme. The scent of the great bull and the sight of his huge and hairy figure had wakened in the heart of Akat a longing for the companionship of his own kind. So Korak was not alone undergoing a change. And Miriam? She was a woman. It is woman's divine right to love. Always she had loved Korak. He was her big brother. Miriam alone underwent no change. She was still happy in the companionship of her Korak. She still loved him as a sister loves an indulgent brother, and she was very, very proud of him. In all the jungle there was no other creature so strong, so handsome, or so brave. Korak came close to her. There was a new light in his eyes as she looked up into them, but she did not understand it. She did not realize how close they were to maturity, nor aught of all the difference in their lives the look in Korak's eyes might mean. "Miriam," he whispered, and his voice was husky as he laid a brown hand upon her bare shoulder. "Miriam!" Suddenly he crushed her to him. She looked up into his face, laughing, and then he bent and kissed her full upon the mouth. Even then she did not understand. She did not recall ever having been kissed before. It was very nice. Miriam liked it. She thought it was Korak's way of showing how glad he was that the great ape had not succeeded in running away with her. She was glad too, so she put her arms about the killer's neck and kissed him again and again. Then, discovering the doll in his belt, she transferred it to her own possession, kissing it as she had kissed Korak. Korak wanted her to say something. He wanted to tell her how he loved her, but the emotion of his love choked him and the vocabulary of the Mangani was limited. There came a sudden interruption. It was from Akat, a sudden, low growl, no louder than those he had been giving vent to while he pranced about the dead bull, nor half so loud in fact, but of a timbre that bore straight to the perceptive faculties of the jungle beast ingrained in Korak. It was a warning. Korak looked quickly up from the glorious vision of the sweet face so close to his. Now his other faculties awoke. His ears, his nostrils were on the alert. Something was coming. The killer moved to Akat's side. Miriam was just behind them. The three stood like carved statues gazing into the leafy tangle of the jungle. The noise that had attracted their attention increased, and presently a great ape broke through the underbrush a few paces from where they stood. The beast halted at sight of them. He gave a warning grunt back over his shoulder, and a moment later, coming cautiously, another bull appeared. He was followed by others, both bulls and females with young, until 20 hairy monsters stood glaring at the three. It was the tribe of the dead king ape. Akat was the first to speak. He pointed to the body of the dead bull. "Korak, mighty fighter, has killed your king," he grunted. "There is none greater in all the jungle than Korak, son of Tarzan. Now Korak is king. What bull is greater than Korak?" It was a challenge to any bull who might care to question Korak's right to the kingship. The apes jabbered and chattered and growled among themselves for a time. At last a young bull came slowly forward, rocking upon his short legs, bristling, growling, terrible. The beast was enormous, and in the full prime of his strength. He belonged to that almost extinct species for which white men have long sought upon the information of the natives of the more inaccessible jungles. Even the natives seldom see these great, hairy, primordial men. Korak advanced to meet the monster. He, too, was growling. In his mind a plan was revolving. To close with this powerful, untired brute after having just passed through a terrific battle with another of his kind would have been to tempt defeat. He must find an easier way to victory. Crouching, he prepared to meet the charge which he knew would soon come, nor did he have long to wait. His antagonist paused only for sufficient time to permit him to recount for the edification of the audience and the confounding of Korak a brief resume of his former victories, of his prowess, and of what he was about to do to this puny Tarmangani. Then he charged. With clutching fingers and wide-opened jaws he came down upon the waiting Korak with the speed of an express train. Korak did not move until the great arms swung to embrace him, then he dropped low beneath them, swung a terrific right to the side of the beast's jaw as he sidestepped his rushing body, and swinging quickly about stood ready over the fallen ape where he sprawled upon the ground. It was a surprised anthropoid that attempted to scramble to its feet. Froth flecked its hideous lips. Red were the little eyes. Blood-curdling roars tumbled from the deep chest. But it did not reach its feet. The killer stood waiting above it, and the moment that the hairy chin came upon the proper level another blow that would have felled an ox sent the ape over backward. Again and again the beast struggled to arise, but each time the mighty Tarmangani stood waiting with ready fist and pile-driver blow to bowl him over. Weaker and weaker became the efforts of the bull. Blood smeared his face and breast. A red stream trickled from nose and mouth. The crowd that had cheered him on at first with savage yells, now jeered him. Their approbation was for the Tarmangani. Kagoda, inquired Korak, as he sent the bull down once more. Again the stubborn bull essayed to scramble to his feet. Again the killer struck him a terrific blow. Again he put the question, Kagoda, have you had enough? For a moment the bull lay motionless. Then from between battered lips came the single word, Kagoda. Then rise and go back among your people, said Korak. I do not wish to be king among people who once drove me from them. Keep your own ways, and we will keep ours. When we meet we may be friends, but we shall not live together. An old bull came slowly toward the killer. You have killed our king, he said. You have defeated him who would have been king. You could have killed him had you wished. What shall we do for a king? Korak turned toward Akat. There is your king, he said. But Akat did not want to be separated from Korak, although he was anxious enough to remain with his own kind. He wanted Korak to remain, too. He said as much. The youth was thinking of Miriam, of what would be best and safest for her. If Akat went away with the apes there would be but one to watch over and protect her. On the other hand, were they to join the tribe he would never feel safe to leave Miriam behind when he went out to hunt, for the passions of the ape folk are not ever well controlled. Even a female might develop an insane hatred for the slender white girl and kill her during Korak's absence. We will live near you, he said, at last. When you change your hunting ground we will change ours, Miriam and I, and so remain near you, but we shall not dwell among you. Akat raised objections to this plan. He did not wish to be separated from Korak. At first he refused to leave his human friend for the companionship of his own kind, but when he saw the last of the tribe wandering off into the jungle again and his glance rested upon the lithe figure of the dead king's young mate as she cast admiring glances at her lord's successor, the call of blood would not be denied. With a farewell glance toward his beloved Korak he turned and followed the she-ape into the labyrinthine mazes of the wood. After Korak had left the village of the blacks following his last thieving expedition, the screams of his victim and those of the other women and children had brought the warriors in from the forest and the river. Great was the excitement and hot was the rage of the men when they learned that the white devil had again entered their homes, frightened their women and stolen arrows and ornaments and food. Even their superstitious fear of this weird creature who hunted with a huge bull ape was overcome in their desire to wreak vengeance upon him and rid themselves for good and all of the menace of his presence in the jungle. And so it was that a score of the fleetest and most doughty warriors of the tribe set out in pursuit of Korak and Akut but a few minutes after they had left the scene of the killer's many depredations. The youth and the ape had traveled slowly and with no precautions against a successful pursuit. Nor was their attitude of careless indifference to the blacks at all remarkable. So many similar raids had gone unpunished that the two had come to look upon the Negroes with contempt. The return journey led them straight upwind. The result being that the scent of their pursuers was borne away from them, so they proceeded upon their way in total ignorance of the fact that tireless trackers but little less expert in the mysteries of woodcraft than themselves were dogging their trail with savage insistence. The little party of warriors was led by Kovudu, the chief, a middle-aged savage of exceptional cunning and bravery. It was he who first came within sight of the quarry which they had followed for hours by the mysterious methods of their almost uncanny powers of observation, intuition, and even scent. Kovudu and his men came upon Korak, Akut, and Miriam after the killing of the king ape, the noise of the combat having led them at last straight to their quarry. The sight of the slender white girl had amazed the savage chief and held him gazing at the trio for a moment before ordering his warriors to rush out upon their prey. In that moment it was that the great apes came and again the blacks remained awestruck witnesses to the palaver, and the battle between Korak and the young bull. But now the apes had gone, and the white youth and the white maid stood alone in the jungle. One of Kovudu's men leaned close to the ear of his chief. "Look," he whispered, and pointed to something that dangled at the girl's side. "When my brother and I were slaves in the village of the Sheikh, my brother made that thing for the Sheikh's little daughter. She played with it always and called it after my brother, whose name is Gika. Just before we escaped, someone came and struck down the Sheikh, stealing his daughter away. If this is she, the Sheikh will pay you well for her return." Korak's arm had again gone around the shoulders of Miriam. Love raced hot through his young veins. Civilization was but a half-remembered state, London as remote as ancient Rome. In all the world there were but they two, Korak, the killer, and Miriam, his mate. Again he drew her close to him and covered her willing lips with his hot kisses. And then from behind him broke a hideous bedlam of savage war cries and a score of shrieking blacks were upon them. Korak turned to give battle. Miriam with her own light spear stood by his side. An avalanche of barbed missiles flew about them. One pierced Korak's shoulder, another his leg, and he went down. Miriam was unscathed, for the blacks had intentionally spared her. Now they rushed forward to finish Korak and make good the girl's capture, but as they came there came also from another point in the jungle the great Akut and at his heels the huge bulls of his new kingdom. Snarling and roaring they rushed upon the black warriors when they saw the mischief they had already wrought. Kovudu, realizing the danger of coming to close quarters with these mighty ape men, seized Miriam and called upon his warriors to retreat. For a time the apes followed them, and several of the blacks were badly mauled and one killed before they succeeded in escaping. Nor would they have gotten off thus easily had Akut not been more concerned with the condition of the wounded Korak than with the fate of the girl upon whom he had always looked as more or less of an interloper and an unquestioned burden. Korak lay bleeding and unconscious when Akut reached his side. The great ape tore the heavy spears from his flesh, licked the wounds and then carried his friend to the lofty shelter that Korak had constructed for Miriam. Further than this the brute could do nothing. Nature must accomplish the rest unaided or Korak must die. He did not die, however. For days he lay helpless with fever, while Akut and the apes hunted close by that they might protect him from such birds and beasts as might reach his lofty retreat. Occasionally Akut brought him juicy fruits which helped to slake his thirst and allay his fever, and little by little his powerful constitution overcame the effects of the spear thrusts. The wounds healed and his strength returned. All during his rational moments as he had lain upon the soft furs which lined Miriam's nest he had suffered more acutely from fears for Miriam than from the pain of his own wounds. For her he must live. For her he must regain his strength that he might set out in search of her. What had the blacks done to her? Did she still live, or had they sacrificed her to their lust for torture and human flesh? Korak almost trembled with terror as the most hideous possibilities of the girl's fate suggested themselves to him out of his knowledge of the customs of Kovudu's tribe. The days dragged their weary lengths along, but at last he had sufficiently regained his strength to crawl from the shelter and make his way unaided to the ground. Now he lived more upon raw meat, for which he was entirely dependent on Akut's skill and generosity. With the meat diet his strength returned more rapidly, and at last he felt that he was fit to undertake the journey to the village of the blacks. Chapter 12. Two tall, bearded white men moved cautiously through the jungle from their camp beside a wide river. They were Carl Jensen and Sven Malbin, but little altered in appearance since the day, years before, that they and their safari had been so badly frightened by Korak and Akut as the former sought haven with them. Every year had they come into the jungle to trade with the natives, or to rob them, to hunt and trap, or to guide other white men in the land they knew so well. Always since their experience with the Sheikh had they operated at a safe distance from his territory. Now they were closer to his village than they had been for years, yet safe enough from discovery owing to the uninhabited nature of the intervening jungle and the fear and enmity of Kovudu's people for the Sheikh, who, in time past, had raided and all but exterminated the tribe. This year they had come to trap live specimens for a European zoological garden, and today they were approaching a trap which they had set in the hope of capturing a specimen of the large baboons that frequented the neighborhood. As they approached the trap they became aware from the noises emanating from its vicinity that their efforts had been crowned with success. The barking and screaming of hundreds of baboons could mean naught else than that one or more of their number had fallen a victim to the allurements of the bait. The extreme caution of the two men was prompted by former experiences with the intelligent and dog-like creatures with which they had to deal. More than one trapper has lost his life in battle with enraged baboons who will hesitate to attack nothing upon one occasion, while upon another a single gunshot will disperse hundreds of them. Heretofore the Swedes had always watched near by their trap, for as a rule only the stronger bulls are thus caught, since in their greediness they prevent the weaker from approaching the covered bait, and when once within the ordinary rude trap woven on the spot of interlaced branches they are able, with the aid of their friends upon the outside, to demolish their prison and escape. But in this instance the trappers had utilized a special steel cage which could withstand all the strength and cunning of a baboon. It was only necessary, therefore, to drive away the herd which they knew were surrounding the prison and wait for their boys who were even now following them to the trap. As they came within sight of the spot they found conditions precisely as they had expected. A large male was battering frantically against the steel wires of the cage that held him captive. Upon the outside several hundred other baboons were tearing and tugging in his aid, and all were roaring and jabbering and barking at the top of their lungs. But what neither the Swedes nor the baboons saw was the half-naked figure of a youth hidden in the foliage of a nearby tree. He had come upon the scene at almost the same instant as Jensen and Malbin, and was watching the activities of the baboons with every mark of interest. Korak's relations with the baboons had never been over-friendly. A species of armed toleration had marked their occasional meetings. The baboons and Akut had walked stiff-legged and growling past one another, while Korak had maintained a bared-fang neutrality. So now he was not greatly disturbed by the predicament of their king. Curiosity prompted him to tarry a moment, and in that moment his quick eyes caught the unfamiliar coloration of the clothing of the two Swedes behind a bush not far from him. Now he was all alertness. Who were these interlopers? What was their business in the jungle of the Mangani? Korak slunk noiselessly around them to a point where he might get their scent as well as a better view of them, and scarce had he done so when he recognized them. They were the men who had fired upon him years before. His eyes blazed. He could feel the hairs upon his scalp stiffen at the roots. He watched them with the intentness of a panther about to spring upon its prey. He saw them rise and, shouting, attempt to frighten away the baboons as they approached the cage. Then one of them raised his rifle and fired into the midst of the surprised and angry herd. For an instant Korak thought that the baboons were about to charge, but 2 more shots from the rifles of the white men sent them scampering into the trees. Then the 2 Europeans advanced upon the cage. Korak thought that they were going to kill the king. He cared nothing for the king, but he cared less for the 2 white men. The king had never attempted to kill him, the white men had. The king was a denizen of his own beloved jungle, the white men were aliens. His loyalty therefore was to the baboon against the human. He could speak the language of the baboon, it was identical to that of the great apes. Across the clearing he saw the jabbering horde watching. Raising his voice he shouted to them. The white men turned at the sound of this new factor behind them. They thought it was another baboon that had circled them, but though they searched the trees with their eyes they saw nothing of the now silent figure hidden by the foliage. Again Korak shouted. "I am the killer," he cried. "These men are my enemies and yours. I will help you free your king. Run out upon the strangers when you see me do so, and together we will drive them away and free your king." And from the baboons came a great chorus, "We will do what you say, Korak." Dropping from his tree, Korak ran toward the 2 Swedes, and at the same instant 300 baboons followed his example. At sight of the strange apparition of the half-naked white warrior rushing upon them with uplifted spear, Jensen and Malbin raised their rifles and fired at Korak, but in the excitement both missed and a moment later the baboons were upon them. Now their only hope of safety lay in escape, and dodging here and there, fighting off the great beasts that leaped upon their backs, they ran into the jungle. Even then they would have died but for the coming of their men whom they met a couple of 100 yards from the cage. Once the white men had turned in flight, Korak gave them no further attention, turning instead to the imprisoned baboon. The fastenings of the door that had eluded the mental powers of the baboons yielded their secret immediately to the human intelligence of the killer, and a moment later the king baboon stepped forth to liberty. He wasted no breath in thanks to Korak, nor did the young man expect thanks. He knew that none of the baboons would ever forget his service, though as a matter of fact he did not care if they did. What he had done had been prompted by a desire to be revenged upon the 2 white men. The baboons could never be of service to him. Now they were racing in the direction of the battle that was being waged between their fellows and the followers of the 2 Swedes, and as the din of battle subsided in the distance, Korak turned and resumed his journey toward the village of Kovudu. On the way he came upon a herd of elephants standing in an open forest glade. Here the trees were too far apart to permit Korak to travel through the branches, a trail he much preferred not only because of its freedom from dense underbrush and the wider field of vision it gave him but from pride in his arboreal ability. It was exhilarating to swing from tree to tree, to test the prowess of his mighty muscles, to reap the pleasurable fruits of his hard-won agility. Korak joyed in the thrills of the high-flung upper terraces of the great forest, where, unhampered and unhindered, he might laugh down upon the great brutes who must keep forever to the darkness and the gloom of the musty soil. But here, in this open glade where Tanta flapped his giant ears and swayed his huge bulk from side to side, the ape-man must pass along the surface of the ground, a pygmy amongst giants. A great bull raised his trunk to rattle a low warning as he sensed the coming of an intruder. His weak eyes roved hither and thither, but it was his keen scent and acute hearing which first located the ape-man. The herd moved restlessly, prepared for fight, for the old bull had caught the scent of man. "Peace, Tanta," called the killer. "It is I, Korak, Tumangani." The bull lowered his trunk and the herd resumed their interrupted meditations. Korak passed within a foot of the great bull. A sinuous trunk undulated toward him, touching his brown hide in a half-caress. Korak slapped the great shoulder affectionately as he went by. For years he had been upon good terms with Tanta and his people. Of all the jungle folk he loved best the mighty pachyderm, the most peaceful and at the same time the most terrible of them all. The gentle gazelle feared him not, yet Numa, lord of the jungle, gave him a wide berth. Among the younger bulls, the cows, and the calves Korak wound his way. Now and then another trunk would run out to touch him, and once a playful calf grasped his legs and upset him. The afternoon was almost spent when Korak arrived at the village of Kavudu. There were many natives lolling in shady spots beside the conical huts or beneath the branches of the several trees which had been left standing within the enclosure. Warriors were in evidence upon hand. It was not a good time for a lone enemy to prosecute a search through the village. Korak determined to await the coming of darkness. He was a match for many warriors, but he could not, unaided, overcome an entire tribe, not even for his beloved Miriam. While he waited among the branches and foliage of a nearby tree, he searched the village constantly with his keen eyes, and twice he circled it, sniffing the vagrant breezes which puffed erratically from first one point of the compass and then another. Among the various stenches peculiar to a native village, the ape man's sensitive nostrils were finally rewarded by cognizance of the delicate aroma which marked the presence of her he sought. Miriam was there in one of those huts. But which one he could not know without closer investigation, and so he waited, with the dogged patience of a beast of prey, until night had fallen. The campfires of the blacks dotted the gloom with little points of light, casting their feeble rays in tiny circles of luminosity that brought into glistening relief the naked bodies of those who lay or squatted about them. It was then that Korak slid silently from the tree that had hidden him and dropped lightly to the ground within the enclosure. Keeping well in the shadows of the huts, he commenced a systematic search of the village, ears, eyes, and nose constantly upon the alert for the first intimation of the near presence of Miriam. His progress must of necessity be slow, since not even the keen-eared curs of the savages must guess the presence of a stranger within the gates. How close he came to a detection on several occasions the killer well knew from the restless whining of several of them. It was not until he reached the back of a hut at the head of the wide village street that Korak caught again, plainly, the scent of Miriam. With nose close to the thatched wall, Korak sniffed eagerly about the structure, tense and palpitant as a hunting hound. Toward the front and the door he made his way when once his nose had assured him that Miriam lay within, but as he rounded the side and came within view of the entrance, he saw a burly Negro armed with a long spear squatting at the portal of the girls' prison. The fellow's back was toward him, his figure outlined against the glow of cooking fires further down the street. He was alone. The nearest of his fellows were beside a fire 60 or 70 feet beyond. To enter the hut, Korak must either silence the sentry or pass him unnoticed. The danger in the accomplishment of the former alternative lay in the practical certainty of alarming the warriors nearby and bringing them and the balance of the village down upon him. To achieve the latter appeared practically impossible. To you or me it would have been impossible, but Korak, the killer, was not as you or I. There was a good 12 inches of space between the broad back of the black and the frame of the doorway. Could Korak pass through behind the savage warrior without detection? The light that fell upon the glistening ebony of the sentry's black skin fell also upon the light brown of Korak's. Should one of the many further down the street chance to look long in this direction, they must surely note the tall, light-colored, moving figure, but Korak depended upon their interest in their own gossip to hold their attention fast where it already lay, and upon the firelight near them to prevent them seeing too plainly at a distance into the darkness at the village end where his work lay. Flattened against the side of the hut, yet not arousing a single warning rustle from its dried thatching, the killer came closer and closer to the watcher. Now he was at his shoulder. Now he had wormed his sinuous way behind him. He could feel the heat of the naked body against his knees. He could hear the man breathe. He marveled that the dull-witted creature had not long since been alarmed, but the fellow sat there as ignorant of the presence of another as though that other had not existed. Korak moved scarcely more than an inch at a time, then he would stand motionless for a moment. Thus was he worming his way behind the guard when the latter straightened up, opened his cavernous mouth in a wide yawn, and stretched his arms above his head. Korak stood rigid as stone. Another step and he would be within the hut. The black lowered his arms and relaxed. Behind him was the framework of the doorway. Often before had it supported his sleepy head, and now he leaned back to enjoy the forbidden pleasure of a cat nap. But instead of the door frame, his head and shoulders came in contact with the warm flesh of a pair of living legs. The exclamation of surprise that almost burst from his lips was throttled in his throat by steel-thewed fingers that closed about his windpipe with the suddenness of thought. The black struggled to arise, to turn upon the creature that had seized him, to wriggle from its hold, but all to no purpose. As he had been held in a mighty vice of iron, he could not move. He could not scream. Those awful fingers at his throat but closed more and more tightly. His eyes bulged from their sockets. His face turned an ashy blue. Presently he relaxed once more, this time in the final dissolution from which there is no quickening. Korak propped the dead body against the door frame. There it sat, lifelike in the gloom. Then the ape-man turned and glided into the Stygian darkness of the hut's interior. "Miriam," he whispered. "Korak." "My Korak," came an answering cry, subdued by fear of alarming her captors, and half stifled by a sob of joyful welcome. The youth knelt and cut the bonds that held the girl's wrists and ankles. A moment later he had lifted her to her feet, and grasping her by the hand led her towards the entrance. Outside, the grim sentinel of death kept his grisly vigil. Sniffing at his dead feet whined a mangy native cur. At sight of the two emerging from the hut, the beast gave an ugly snarl, and an instant later, as it caught the scent of the strange white man, it raised a series of excited yelps. Instantly the warriors at the nearby fire were attracted. They turned their heads in the direction of the commotion. It was impossible that they should fail to see the white skins of the fugitives. Korak slunk quickly into the shadows at the hut's side, drawing Miriam with him, but he was too late. The blacks had seen enough to arouse their suspicions, and a dozen of them were now running to investigate. The yapping cur was still at Korak's heels, leading the searchers unerringly in pursuit. The youth struck viciously at the brute with his long spear, but, long accustomed to dodging blows, the wily creature made a most uncertain target. Other blacks had been alarmed by the running and shouting of their companions, and now the entire population of the village was swarming up the street to assist in the search. Their first discovery was the dead body of the sentry, and a moment later one of the bravest of them had entered the hut and discovered the absence of the prisoner. These startling announcements filled the blacks with a combination of terror and rage, but, seeing no foe in evidence, they were enabled to permit their rage to get the better of their terror, and so the leaders, pushed on by those behind them, ran rapidly around the hut in the direction of the yapping of the mangy cur. Here they found a single white warrior making away with their captive, and recognizing him as the author of numerous raids and indignities, and believing that they had him cornered and at a disadvantage, they charged savagely upon him. Korak, seeing that they were discovered, lifted Miriam to his shoulders and ran for the tree which would give them egress from the village. He was handicapped in his flight by the weight of the girl, whose legs would but scarce bear her weight, to say nothing of maintaining her in rapid flight, for the tightly drawn bonds that had been about her ankles for so long had stopped circulation and partially paralyzed her extremities. Had this not been the case, the escape of the two would have been a feat of little moment, since Miriam was scarcely a whit less agile than Korak, and fully as much at home in the trees as he. But with the girl on his shoulder, Korak could not both run and fight to advantage, and the result was that before he had covered half the distance to the tree, a score of native curs, attracted by the yelping of their mate and the yells and shouts of their masters, had closed in upon the fleeing white man, snapping at his legs and at last succeeding in tripping him. As he went down, the hyena-like brutes were upon him, and as he struggled to his feet, the blacks closed in. A couple of them seized the clawing, biting Miriam, and subdued her. A blow upon the head was sufficient. For the ape-man, they found more drastic measures would be necessary. Weighted down as he was by dogs and warriors, he still managed to struggle to his feet. To right and left he swung crushing blows to the faces of his human antagonists. To the dogs he paid not the slightest attention other than to seize the more persistent and wring their necks with a single quick movement of the wrist. A knob stick aimed at him by an ebon Hercules he caught and wrested from his antagonist, and then the blacks experienced to the full the possibilities for punishment that lay within those smooth-flowing muscles beneath the velvet brown skin of the strange, white giant. He rushed among them with all the force and ferocity of a bull elephant gone mad. Hither and thither he charged, striking down the few who had the temerity to stand against him, and it was evident that unless a chance spear thrust brought him down he would rout the entire village and regain his prize. But old Kovudu was not to be so easily robbed of the ransom which the girl represented, and seeing that their attack, which had up to now resulted in a series of individual combats with the white warrior, he called his tribesmen off, and forming them in a compact body about the girl and the two who watched over her, bid them do nothing more than repel the assaults of the ape-man. Again and again Korak rushed against this human barricade bristling with spear points. Again and again he was repulsed, often with severe wounds to caution him to greater wariness. From head to foot he was red with his own blood, and at last, weakening from the loss of it, he came to the bitter realization that alone he could do no more to succor his Miriam. Presently an idea flashed through his brain. He called aloud to the girl. She had regained consciousness now and replied. "Korak goes," he shouted, "but he will return and take you from the Gomangani. Goodbye, my Miriam. Korak will come for you again." "Goodbye," cried the girl. "Miriam will look for you until you come." Like a flash, and before they could know his intention or prevent him, Korak wheeled, raced across the village and with a single leap disappeared into the foliage of the great tree that was his highroad to the village of Kovudu. A shower of spears followed him, but their only harvest was a taunting laugh flung back from out the darkness of the jungle. Chapter 13. Miriam, again bound and under heavy guard in Kovudu's own hut, saw the night pass and the new day come without bringing the momentarily looked-for return of Korak. She had no doubt but that he would come back, and less still that he would easily free her from her captivity. To her Korak was little short of omnipotent. He embodied for her all that was finest and strongest and best in her savage world. She gloried in his prowess and worshipped him for the tender thoughtfulness that always had marked his treatment of her. No other within the ken of her memory had ever accorded her the love and gentleness that was his daily offering to her. Most of the gentler attributes of his early childhood had long since been forgotten in the fierce battle for existence which the customs of the mysterious jungle had forced upon him. He was more often savage and bloodthirsty than tender and kindly. His other friends of the wild looked for no gentle tokens of his affection. That he would hunt with them and fight for them was sufficient. If he growled and showed his fighting fangs when they trespassed upon his inalienable rights to the fruits of his kills, they felt no anger toward him, only greater respect for the efficient and the fit, for him who could not only kill but protect the flesh of his kill. But toward Miriam he always had shown more of his human side. He killed primarily for her. It was to the feet of Miriam that he brought the fruits of his labors. It was for Miriam more than for himself that he squatted beside his flesh and growled ominously at whosoever dared sniff too closely to it. When he was cold in the dark days of rain, or thirsty in a prolonged drought, his discomfort engendered first of all thoughts of Miriam's welfare after she had been made warm, after her thirst had been slaked, then he turned to the affair of ministering to his own wants. The softest skins fell gracefully from the graceful shoulders of his Miriam. The sweetest scented grasses lined her bower where other soft, furry pelts made hers the downiest couch in all the jungle. What wonder then that Miriam loved her Korak? But she loved him as a little sister might love a big brother who was very good to her. As yet she knew naught of the love of a maid for a man. So now as she lay waiting for him she dreamed of him and of all that he meant to her. She compared him with the Sheikh, her father, and at thought of the stern, grizzled, old Arab she shuddered. Even the savage blacks had been less harsh to her than he. Not understanding their tongue she could not guess what purpose they had in keeping her a prisoner. She knew that man ate man, and she had expected to be eaten, but she had been with them for some time now and no harm had befallen her. She did not know that a runner had been dispatched to the distant village of the Sheikh to barter with him for a ransom. She did not know, nor did Kovudu, that the runner had never reached his destination, that he had fallen in with the safari of Yensen and Malbin and with the talkativeness of a native to other natives had unfolded his whole mission to the black servants of the two Swedes. These had not been long in retailing the matter to their masters, and the result was that when the runner left their camp to continue his journey, he had scarce passed from sight before there came the report of a rifle and he rolled lifeless into the underbrush with a bullet in his back. A few moments later Malbin strolled back into the encampment, where he went to some pains to let it be known that he had had a shot at a fine buck and missed. The Swedes knew that their men hated them, and that an overt act against Kovudu would quickly be carried to the chief at the first opportunity. Nor were they sufficiently strong in either guns or loyal followers to risk antagonizing the wily old chief. Following this episode came the encounter with the baboons and the strange, white savage who had allied himself with the beasts against the humans. Only by dint of masterful maneuvering and the expenditure of much power had the Swedes been able to repulse the infuriated apes, and even for hours afterward their camp was constantly besieged by hundreds of snarling, screaming devils. The Swedes, rifles in hand, repelled numerous savage charges which lacked only efficient leadership to have rendered them as effective in results as they were terrifying in appearance. Time and time again the two men thought they saw the smooth-skinned body of the wild ape-man moving among the baboons in the forest, and the belief that he might head a charge upon them proved most disquieting. They would have given much for a clean shot at him, for to him they attributed the loss of their specimen and the ugly attitude of the baboons toward them. "The fellow must be the same we fired on several years ago," said Malbin. "That time he was accompanied by a gorilla. Did you get a good look at him, Carl?" "Yes," replied Jensen. "He was not 5 paces from me when I fired at him. He appears to be an intelligent-looking European and not much more than a lad. There is nothing of the imbecile or degenerate in his features or expression, as is usually true in similar cases, where some lunatic escapes into the woods and by living in filth and nakedness wins the title of wild man among the peasants of the neighborhood. No, this fellow is of different stuff and so infinitely more to be feared. As much as I should like a shot at him, I hope he stays away. Should he ever deliberately lead a charge against us, I wouldn't give much for our chances if we happened to fail to bag him at the first rush." But the white giant did not appear again to lead the baboons against them, and finally the angry brutes themselves wandered off into the jungle, leaving the frightened safari in peace. The next day the Swedes set out for Kovudu's village, bent on securing possession of the person of the white girl whom Kovudu's runner had told them lay captive in the chief's village. How they were to accomplish their end they did not know. Force was out of the question, though they would not have hesitated to use it had they possessed it. In former years they had marched roughshod over enormous areas, taking toll by brute force even when kindliness or diplomacy would have accomplished more. But now they were in bad straits, so bad that they had shown their true colors scarce twice in a year, and then only when they came upon an isolated village, weak in numbers and poor in courage. Kovudu was not as these, and though his village was in a way remote from the more populous district to the north, his power was such that he maintained an acknowledged suzerainty over the thin thread of villages which connected him with the savage lords to the north. To have antagonized him would have spelled ruin for the Swedes. It would have meant that they might never reach civilization by the northern route. To the west, the village of the Shek lay directly in their path, barring them effectually. To the east the trail was unknown to them, and to the south there was no trail. So the two Swedes approached the village of Kovudu with friendly words upon their tongues and deep craft in their hearts. Their plans were well made. There was no mention of the white prisoner. They chose to pretend that they were not aware that Kovudu had a white prisoner. They exchanged gifts with the old chief, haggling with his plenipotentiaries over the value of what they were to receive for what they gave, as is customary and proper when one has no ulterior motives. Unwarranted generosity would have aroused suspicion. During the palaver which followed they retailed the gossip of the villages through which they had passed, receiving in exchange such news as Kovudu possessed. The palaver was long and tiresome, as these native ceremonies always are to Europeans. Kovudu made no mention of his prisoner, and from his generous offers of guides and presents seemed anxious to assure himself of the speedy departure of his guests. It was Malbin who, quite casually, near the close of their talk, mentioned the fact that the Shek was dead. Kovudu evinced interest and surprise. "You did not know it?" asked Malbin. "That is strange. It was during the last moon. He fell from his horse when the beast stepped in a hole. The horse fell upon him. When his men came up, the sheikh was quite dead. Kovudu scratched his head. He was much disappointed. No sheikh meant no ransom for the white girl. Now she was worthless, unless he utilized her for a feast or a mate. The latter thought aroused him. He spat at a small beetle crawling through the dust before him. He eyed Malbin appraisingly. These white men were peculiar. They traveled far from their own villages without women. Yet he knew they cared for women. But how much did they care for them? That was the question that disturbed Kovudu. I know where there is a white girl, he said, unexpectedly. If you wish to buy her, she may be her cheap. Malbin shrugged. We have troubles enough, Kovudu, he said, without burdening ourselves with an old she-hyena, and as for paying for one, Malbin snapped his fingers in derision. She is young, said Kovudu, and good-looking. The Swedes laughed. There are no good-looking white women in the jungle, Kovudu, said Yen-sen. You should be ashamed to try to make fun of old friends. Kovudu sprang to his feet. Come, he said, I will show you that she is all I say. Malbin and Yen-sen rose to follow him, and as they did so their eyes met, and Malbin slowly drooped one of his lids in a sly wink. Together they followed Kovudu toward his hut. In the dim interior they discerned the figure of a woman lying bound upon a sleeping mat. Malbin took a single glance and turned away. She must be 1,000 years old, Kovudu, he said, as he left the hut. She is young, cried the savage. It is dark in here. You cannot see. Wait, I will have her brought out into the sunlight, and he commanded the two warriors who watched the girl to cut the bonds from her ankles and lead her forth for inspection. Malbin and Yen-sen evinced no eagerness, though both were fairly bursting with it, not to see the girl but to obtain possession of her. They cared not if she had the face of a marmoset, or the figure of pot-bellied Kovudu himself. All that they wished to know was that she was the girl who had been stolen from the sheikh several years before. They thought that they would recognize her for such if she was indeed the same, but even so the testimony of the runner Kovudu had sent to the sheikh was such as to assure them that the girl was the one they had once before attempted to abduct. As Mariam was brought forth from the darkness of the hut's interior, the two men turned with every appearance of disinterestedness to glance at her. It was with difficulty that Malbin suppressed an ejaculation of astonishment. The girl's beauty fairly took his breath from him, but instantly he recovered his poise and turned to Kovudu. Well, he said to the old chief. Is she not both young and good-looking? Asked Kovudu. She is not old, replied Malbin, but even so she will be a burden. We did not come from the north after wives, there are more than enough there for us. Mariam stood looking straight at the white men. She expected nothing from them, they were to her as much enemies as the black men. She hated and feared them all. Malbin spoke to her in Arabic. We are friends, he said. Would you like to have us take you away from here? Slowly and dimly, as though from a great distance, recollection of the once familiar tongue returned to her. I should like to go free, she said, and go back to Korak. You would like to go with us, persisted Malbin. No, said Mariam. Malbin turned to Kovudu. She does not wish to go with us, he said. You are men, returned the black. Can you not take her by force? It would only add to our troubles, replied the Swede. No, Kovudu, we do not wish her, though, if you wish to be rid of her, we will take her away because of our friendship for you. Now Kovudu knew that he had made a sale. They wanted her. So he commenced to bargain, and in the end the person of Mariam passed from the possession of the black chieftain into that of the two Swedes in consideration of 6 yards of American, 3 empty brass cartridge shells and a shiny, new jackknife from New Jersey. And all but Mariam were more than pleased with the bargain. Kovudu stipulated but a single condition, and that was that the Europeans were to leave his village and take the girl with them as early the next morning as they could get started. After the sale was consummated, he did not hesitate to explain his reasons for this demand. He told them of the strenuous attempt of the girl's savage mate to rescue her, and suggested that the sooner they got her out of the country, the more likely they were to retain possession of her. Miriam was again bound and placed under guard, but this time in the tent of the Swedes. Malbin talked to her, trying to persuade her to accompany them willingly. He told her that they would return her to her own village, but when he discovered that she would rather die than go back to the old Shek, he assured her that they would not take her there, nor, as a matter of fact, had they had an intention of so doing. As he talked with the girl, the Swede feasted his eyes upon the beautiful lines of her face and figure. She had grown tall and straight and slender toward maturity since he had seen her in the sheik's village on that long-gone day. For years she had represented to him a certain fabulous reward. In his thoughts she had been but the personification of the pleasures and luxuries that many Franks would purchase. Now, as she stood before him pulsing with life and loveliness, she suggested other seductive and alluring possibilities. He came closer to her and laid his hand upon her. The girl shrank from him. He seized her and she struck him heavily in the mouth as he sought to kiss her. Then Jensen entered the tent. "Malbin," he almost shouted. "You fool!" Sven Malbin released his hold upon the girl and turned toward his companion. His face was red with mortification. "What the devil are you trying to do?" growled Jensen. "Would you throw away every chance for the reward? If we maltreat her, we not only couldn't collect a sou, but they'd send us to prison for our pains. I thought you had more sense, Malbin." "I'm not a wooden man," growled Malbin. "You'd better be," rejoined Jensen, "at least until we have delivered her over in safety and collected what will be coming to us." "Oh, hell," cried Malbin. "What's the use? They'll be glad enough to have her back, and by the time we get there with her she'll be only too glad to keep her mouth shut." "Why not?" "Because I say not," growled Jensen. "I've always let you boss things, Sven, but here's a case where what I say has got to go because I'm right and you're wrong, and we both know it." "You're getting damned virtuous all of a sudden," growled Malbin. "Perhaps you think I have forgotten about the innkeeper's daughter, and little Solella, and that nigger at—" "Shut up," snapped Jensen. "It's not a matter of virtue and you are as well aware of that as I. I don't want to quarrel with you, but so help me God, Sven, you're not going to harm this girl if I have to kill you to prevent it. I've suffered and slaved and been nearly killed 40 times in the last 9 or 10 years trying to accomplish what luck has thrown at our feet at last, and now I'm not going to be robbed of the fruits of success because you happen to be more of a beast than a man. Again I warn you, Sven," and he tapped the revolver that swung in its holster at his hip. Malbin gave his friend an ugly look, shrugged his shoulders, and left the tent. Jensen turned to Miriam. "If he bothers you again, call me," he said. "I shall always be near." The girl had not understood the conversation that had been carried on by her two owners, for it had been in Swedish, but what Jensen had just said to her in Arabic she understood, and from it grasped an excellent idea of what had passed between the two. The expressions upon their faces, their gestures, and Jensen's final tapping of his revolver before Malbin had left the tent had all been eloquent of the seriousness of their altercation. Now, toward Jensen she looked for friendship, and with the innocence of youth she threw herself upon his mercy, begging him to set her free, that she might return to Korak and her jungle life. But she was doomed to another disappointment, for the man only laughed at her roughly and told her that if she tried to escape she would be punished by the very thing that he had just saved her from. All that night she lay listening for a signal from Korak. All about the jungle life moved through the darkness. To her sensitive ears came sounds that the others in the camp could not hear, sounds that she interpreted as we might interpret the speech of a friend, but not once came a single note that reflected the presence of Korak. But she knew that he would come. Nothing short of death itself could prevent her Korak from returning for her. What delayed him though? When morning came again and the night had brought no succoring Korak, Miriam's faith and loyalty was still unshaken, though misgivings began to assail her as to the safety of her friend. It seemed unbelievable that serious mishap could have overtaken her wonderful Korak, who daily passed unscathed through all the terrors of the jungle. Yet morning came, the morning meal was eaten, the camp broken, and the disreputable safari of the Swedes was on the move northward with still no sign of the rescue the girl momentarily expected. All that day they marched, and the next, nor did Korak even so much as show himself to the patient little waiter moving, silently and stately, beside her hard captors. Malbin remained scowling and angry. He replied to Jensen's friendly advances in curt monosyllables. To Miriam he did not speak, but on several occasions she discovered him glaring at her from beneath half-closed lids, greedily. The look sent a shudder through her. She hugged Geeka closer to her breast and doubly regretted the knife that they had taken from her when she was captured by Kavudu. It was on the fourth day that Miriam began definitely to give up hope. Something had happened to Korak. She knew it. He would never come now, and these men would take her far away. Presently they would kill her. She would never see her Korak again. On this day the Swedes rested, for they had marched rapidly and their men were tired. Malbin and Jensen had gone from camp to hunt, taking different directions. They had been gone about an hour when the door of Miriam's tent was lifted and Malbin entered. The look of a beast was on his face. Chapter 14. With wide eyes fixed upon him, like a trapped creature horrified beneath the mesmeric gaze of a great serpent, the girl watched the approach of the man. Her hands were free, the Swedes having secured her with a length of ancient slave chain fastened at one end to an iron collar padlocked about her neck and at the other to a long stake driven deep into the ground. Slowly Miriam shrank inch by inch toward the opposite end of the tent. Malbin followed her. His hands were extended and his fingers half-opened, claw-like, to seize her. His lips were parted, and his breath came quickly, pantingly. The girl recalled Jensen's instructions to call him should Malbin molest her, but Jensen had gone into the jungle to hunt. Malbin had chosen his time well. Yet she screamed, loud and shrill, once, twice, a third time, before Malbin could leap across the tent and throttle her alarming cries with his brute fingers. Then she fought him, as any jungle she might fight, with tooth and nail. The man found her no easy prey. In that slender, young body, beneath the rounded curves and the fine, soft skin, lay the muscles of a young lioness. But Malbin was no weakling. His character and appearance were brutal, nor did they belie his brawn. He was of giant stature and of giant strength. Slowly he forced the girl back upon the ground, striking her in the face when she hurt him badly either with teeth or nails. Miriam struck back, but she was growing weaker from the choking fingers at her throat. Out in the jungle Jensen had brought down 2 bucks. His hunting had not carried him far afield, nor was he prone to permit it to do so. He was suspicious of Malbin. The very fact that his companion had refused to accompany him and elected instead to hunt alone in another direction would not, under ordinary circumstances, have seemed fraught with sinister suggestion, but Jensen knew Malbin well, and so, having secured meat, he turned immediately back toward camp, while his boys brought in his kill. He had covered about half the return journey when a scream came faintly to his ears from the direction of camp. He halted to listen. It was repeated twice. Then silence. With a muttered curse Jensen broke into a rapid run. He wondered if he would be too late. What a fool Malbin was indeed to thus chance jeopardizing a fortune. Further away from camp than Jensen and upon the opposite side another heard Miriam's screams, a stranger who was not even aware of the proximity of white men other than himself, a hunter with a handful of sleek, black warriors. He, too, listened intently for a moment. That the voice was that of a woman in distress he could not doubt, and so he also hastened at a run in the direction of the affrighted voice, but he was much further away than Jensen so that the latter reached the tent first. What the Swede found there roused no pity within his calloused heart, only anger against his fellow scoundrel. Miriam was still fighting off her attacker. Malbin still was showering blows upon her. Yen Sen, streaming foul curses upon his erstwhile friend, burst into the tent. Malbin, interrupted, dropped his victim and turned to meet Jensen's infuriated charge. He whipped a revolver from his hip. Yen Sen, anticipating the lightning move of the other's hand, drew almost simultaneously, and both men fired at once. Yen Sen was still moving toward Malbin at the time, but at the flash of the explosion he stopped. His revolver dropped from nerveless fingers. For a moment he staggered drunkenly. Deliberately Malbin put 2 more bullets into his friend's body at close range. Even in the midst of the excitement and her terror, Miriam found herself wondering at the tenacity of life which the hit man displayed. His eyes were closed, his head dropped forward upon his breast, his hands hung limply before him. Yet still he stood there upon his feet, though he reeled horribly. It was not until the 3rd bullet had found its mark within his body that he lunged forward upon his face. Then Malbin approached him, and with an oath kicked him viciously. Then he returned once more to Miriam. Again he seized her, and at the same instant the flaps of the tent opened silently and a tall white man stood in the aperture. Neither Miriam or Malbin saw the newcomer. The latter's back was toward him while his body hid the stranger from Miriam's eyes. He crossed the tent quickly, stepping over Jensen's body. The first intimation Malbin had that he was not to carry out his design without further interruption was a heavy hand upon his shoulder. He wheeled to face an utter stranger, a tall, black-haired, grey-eyed stranger clad in khaki and pith helmet. Malbin reached for his gun again, but another hand had been quicker than his and he saw the weapon tossed to the ground at the side of the tent out of reach. "What is the meaning of this?" The stranger addressed his question to Miriam in a tongue she did not understand. She shook her head and spoke in Arabic. Instantly the man changed his question to that language. "These men are taking me away from Korak," explained the girl. "This one would have harmed me. The other, whom he had just killed, tried to stop him. They were both very bad men, but this one is the worse. If my Korak were here he would kill him. I suppose you are like them, so you will not kill him." The stranger smiled. "He deserves killing," he said. "There is no doubt of that. Once I should have killed him, but not now. I will see, though, that he does not bother you any more." He was holding Malbin in a grasp the giant Swede could not break, though he struggled to do so, and he was holding him as easily as Malbin might have held a little child, yet Malbin was a huge man, mightily thewed. The Swede began to rage and curse. He struck at his captor, only to be twisted about and held at arm's length. Then he shouted to his boys to come and kill the stranger. In response, a dozen strange blacks entered the tent. They, too, were powerful, clean-limbed men, not at all like the mangy crew that followed the Swedes. "We have had enough foolishness," said the stranger to Malbin. "You deserve death, but I am not the law. I know now who you are. I have heard of you before. You and your friend here bear a most unsavory reputation. We do not want you in our country. I shall let you go this time, but should you ever return I shall take the law into my own hands. You understand?" Malbin blustered and threatened, finishing by applying a most uncomplimentary name to his captor. For this he received a shaking that rattled his teeth. Those who know say that the most painful punishment that can be inflicted upon an adult male, short of injuring him, is a good, old-fashioned shaking. Malbin received such a shaking. "Now get out," said the stranger, "and next time you see me remember who I am," and he spoke a name in the Swede's ear, a name that more effectually subdued the scoundrel than many beatings. Then he gave him a push that carried him bodily through the tent doorway to sprawl upon the turf beyond. "Now," he said, turning toward Miriam, "who has the key to this thing about your neck?" The girl pointed to Jensen's body. "He carried it always," she said. The stranger searched the clothing on the corpse until he came upon the key. A moment more Miriam was free. "Will you let me go back to my Korak?" she asked. "I will see that you are returned to your people," he replied. "Who are they and where is their village?" He had been eyeing her strange, barbaric garmenture wonderingly. From her speech she was evidently an Arab girl, but he had never before seen one thus clothed. "Who are your people? Who is Korak?" he asked again. "Korak? Why, Korak is an ape. I have no other people. Korak and I live in the jungle alone since Aht went to be king of the apes." She had always thus pronounced Akut's name, for so it had sounded to her when first she came with Korak and the ape. Korak could have been kind, but he would not. A questioning expression entered the stranger's eyes. He looked at the girl closely. "So Korak is an ape," he said. "And what, pray, are you?" "I am Miriam. I, also, am an ape." Was the stranger's only oral comment upon this startling announcement, but what he thought might have been partially interpreted through the pitying light that entered his eyes. He approached the girl and started to lay his hand upon her forehead. She drew back with a savage little growl. A smile touched his lips. "You need not fear me," he said. "I shall not harm you. I only wish to discover if you have fever, if you are entirely well. If you are, we will set forth in search of Korak." Miriam looked straight into the keen grey eyes. She must have found there an unquestionable assurance of the honourableness of their owner, for she permitted him to lay his palm upon her forehead and feel her pulse. Apparently she had no fever. "How long have you been an ape?" asked the man. "Since I was a little girl, many, many years ago, and Korak came and took me from my father who was beating me. Since then I have lived in the trees with Korak and Aht." "Where in the jungle lives Korak?" asked the stranger. Miriam pointed with a sweep of her hand that took in, generously, half the continent of Africa. "Could you find your way back to him?" "I do not know," she replied, "but he will find his way to me." "Then I have a plan," said the stranger. "I live but a few marches from here. I shall take you home where my wife will look after you and care for you until we can find Korak or Korak finds us. If he could find you here, he can find you at my village. Is it not so?" Miriam thought that it was so, but she did not like the idea of not starting immediately back to meet Korak. On the other hand, the man had no intention of permitting this poor, insane child to wander further amidst the dangers of the jungle. From whence she had come, or what she had undergone, he could not guess, but that her Korak and their life among the apes was but a figment of a disordered mind he could not doubt. He knew the jungle well, and he knew that men have lived alone and naked among the savage beasts for years, but a frail and slender girl. No, it was not possible. Together they went outside. Malbin's boys were striking camp in preparation for a hasty departure. The strangers' blacks were conversing with them. Malbin stood at a distance, angry and glowering. The stranger approached one of his own men. "Find out where they got this girl," he commanded. The Negro thus addressed questioned one of Malbin's followers. Presently he returned to his master. "They bought her from old Kavudu," he said. "That is all that this fellow will tell me. He pretends that he knows nothing more, and I guess that he does not. These two white men were very bad men. They did many things that their boys knew not the meanings of. It would be well, Bwana, to kill the other. I wish that I might, but a new law is come into this part of the jungle. It is not as it was in the old days, Muviri," replied the master. The stranger remained until Malbin and his safari had disappeared into the jungle toward the north. Miriam, trustful now, stood at his side, Geeka clutched in one slim, brown hand. They talked together, the man wondering at the faltering Arabic of the girl, but attributing it finally to her defective mentality. Could he have known that years had elapsed since she had used it until she was taken by the Swedes, he would not have wondered that she had half forgotten it. There was yet another reason why the language of the Sheikh had thus readily eluded her, but of that reason she herself could not have guessed the truth any better than could the man. He tried to persuade her to return with him to his village, as he called it, or Dua, in Arabic, but she was insistent upon searching immediately for Korak. As a last resort, he determined to take her with him by force rather than sacrifice her life to the insane hallucination which haunted her. But, being a wise man, he determined to humor her first and then attempt to lead her as he would have her go. So when they took up their march, it was in the direction of the south, though his own ranch lay almost due east. By degrees he turned the direction of their way more and more eastward, and greatly was he pleased to note that the girl failed to discover that any change was being made. Little by little she became more trusting. At first she had but her intuition to guide her belief that this big Tomangani meant her no harm, but as the days passed and she saw that his kindness and consideration never faltered, she came to compare him with Korak, and to be very fond of him, but never did her loyalty to her ape-man flag. On the 5th day they came suddenly upon a great plain, and from the edge of the forest the girl saw in the distance fenced fields and many buildings. At the sight she drew back in astonishment. "Where are we?" she asked, pointing. "We could not find Korak," replied the man, "and as our way led near my doer, I have brought you here to wait and rest with my wife until my men can find your ape, or he finds you. It is better thus, little one. You will be safer with us, and you will be happier." "I am afraid, Bwana," said the girl. "In my doer they will beat me as did the Sheikh, my father. Let me go back into the jungle. There Korak will find me. He would not think to look for me in the doer of a white man." "No one will beat you, child," replied the man. "I have not done so, have I? Well, here all belong to me. They will treat you well. Here no one is beaten. My wife will be very good to you, and at last Korak will come, for I shall send men to search for him." The girl shook her head. "They could not bring him, for he would kill them, as all men have tried to kill him. I am afraid. Let me go, Bwana. You do not know the way to your own country. You would be lost. The leopards or the lions would get you the first night, and after all you would not find your Korak. It is better that you stay with us. Did I not save you from the bad man? Do you not owe me something for that? Well, then remain with us for a few weeks at least until we can determine what is best for you. You are only a little girl, it would be wicked to permit you to go alone into the jungle." Maryam laughed. "The jungle," she said, "is my father and my mother. It has been kinder to me than have men. I am not afraid of the jungle. Nor am I afraid of the leopard or the lion. When my time comes I shall die. It may be that a leopard or a lion shall kill me, or it may be a tiny bug no bigger than the end of my littlest finger. When the lion leaps upon me, or the little bug stings me, I shall be afraid. Oh, then I shall be terribly afraid, I know, but life would be very miserable indeed were I to spend it in terror of the thing that has not yet happened. If it be the lion my terror shall be short of life, but if it be the little bug I may suffer for days before I die. And so I fear the lion least of all. He is great and noisy. I can hear him, or see him, or smell him in time to escape, but any moment I may place a hand or foot on the little bug, and never know that he is there until I feel his deadly sting. No, I do not fear the jungle. I love it. I should rather die than leave it forever, but your doer is close beside the jungle. You have been good to me. I will do as you wish, and remain here for a while to wait the coming of my Korak." "Good," said the man, and he led the way down toward the flower-covered bungalow behind which lay the barns and outhouses of a well-ordered African farm. As they came nearer, a dozen dogs ran barking toward them, gaunt wolfhounds, a huge Great Dane, a nimble-footed collie and a number of yapping, quarrelsome fox terriers. At first their appearance was savage and unfriendly in the extreme, but once they recognized the foremost black warriors, and the white man behind them, their attitude underwent a remarkable change. The collie and the fox terriers became frantic with delirious joy, and while the wolfhounds and the Great Dane were not a whit less delighted at the return of their master, their greetings were of a more dignified nature. Each in turn sniffed at Maryam, who displayed not the slightest fear of any of them. The wolfhounds bristled and growled at the scent of wild beasts that clung to her garment, but when she laid her hand upon their heads and her soft voice murmured caressingly, they half closed their eyes, lifting their upper lips in contented canine smiles. The man was watching them and he too smiled, for it was seldom that these savage brutes took thus kindly to strangers. It was as though in some subtle way the girl had breathed a message of kindred savagery to their savage hearts. With her slim fingers grasping the collar of a wolfhound upon either side of her, Miriam walked on toward the bungalow, upon the porch of which a woman dressed in white waved a welcome to her returning lord. There was more fear in the girl's eyes now than there had been in the presence of strange men or savage beasts. She hesitated, turning an appealing glance toward the man. "This is my wife," he said. "She will be glad to welcome you." The woman came down the path to meet them. The man kissed her, and turning toward Miriam introduced them, speaking in the Arab tongue the girl understood. "This is Miriam, my dear," he said, and he told the story of the jungle waif in so far as he knew it. Miriam saw that the woman was beautiful. She saw that sweetness and goodness were stamped indelibly upon her countenance. She no longer feared her, and when her brief story had been narrated and the woman came and put her arms about her and kissed her and called her poor little darling, something snapped in Miriam's little heart. She buried her face on the bosom of this new friend in whose voice was the mother tone that Miriam had not heard for so many years that she had forgotten its very existence. She buried her face on the kindly bosom and wept as she had not wept before in all her life, tears of relief and joy that she could not fathom. And so came Miriam, the savage little Mangani, out of her beloved jungle into the midst of a home of culture and refinement. Already Bwana and my dear, as she first heard them called and continued to call them, were as father and mother to her. Once her savage fears allayed, she went to the opposite extreme of trustfulness and love. Now she was willing to wait here until they found Korak, or Korak found her. She did not give up that thought. Korak, her Korak always was first. Chapter 15. And out in the jungle, far away, Korak, covered with wounds, stiff with clotted blood, burning with rage and sorrow, swung back upon the trail of the great baboons. He had not found them where he had last seen them, nor in any of their usual haunts, but he sought them along the well-marked spoor they had left behind them, and at last he overtook them. When first he came upon them they were moving slowly but steadily southward in one of those periodic migrations, the reasons for which the baboon himself is best able to explain. At sight of the white warrior who came upon them from downwind, the herd halted in response to the warning cry of the sentinel that had discovered him. There was much growling and muttering, much stiff-legged circling on the part of the bulls. The mothers, in nervous, high-pitched tones, called their young to their sides, and with them moved to safety behind their lords and masters. Korak called aloud to the king, who, at the familiar voice, advanced slowly, warily, and still stiff-legged. He must have the confirmatory evidence of his nose before venturing to rely too implicitly upon the testimony of his ears and eyes. Korak stood perfectly still. To have advanced then might have precipitated an immediate attack, or, as easily, a panic of flight. Wild beasts are creatures of nerves. It is a relatively simple thing to throw them into a species of hysteria which may induce either a mania for murder, or symptoms of apparent abject cowardice. It is a question, however, if a wild animal ever is actually a coward. The king baboon approached Korak. He walked around him in an ever-decreasing circle, growling, grunting, sniffing. Korak spoke to him. "I am Korak," he said. "I opened the cage that held you. I saved you from the Tarmangani. I am Korak, the killer. I am your friend." "Ha!" grunted the king. "Yes, you are Korak. My ears told me that you were Korak. My eyes told me that you were Korak. Now my nose tells me that you are Korak. My nose is never wrong. I am your friend. Come, we shall hunt together." "Korak cannot hunt now," replied the ape-man. "The Gomangani have stolen Miriam. They have tied her in their village. They will not let her go. Korak, alone, was unable to set her free. Korak set you free. Now will you bring your people and set Korak's Miriam free? The Gomangani have many sharp sticks which they throw. They pierce the bodies of my people. They kill us. The Gomangani are bad people. They will kill us all if we enter their village. The Tamangani have sticks that make a loud noise and kill at a great distance, replied Korak. They had these when Korak set you free from their trap. If Korak had run away from them, you would now be a prisoner among the Tamangani. The baboon scratched his head. In a rough circle about him and the ape man squatted the bulls of his herd. They blinked their eyes, shouldered one another about for more advantageous positions, scratched in the rotting vegetation upon the chance of unearthing a toothsome worm, or sat listlessly eyeing their king and the strange Mangani, who called himself thus but who more closely resembled the hated Tamangani. The king looked at some of the older of his subjects, as though inviting suggestion. We are too few, grunted one. There are the baboons of the hill country, suggested another. They are as many as the leaves of the forest. They, too, hate the Gomangani. They love to fight. They are very savage. Let us ask them to accompany us. Then can we kill all the Gomangani in the jungle? He rose and growled horribly, bristling his stiff hair. That is the way to talk, cried the killer, but we do not need the baboons of the hill country. We are enough. It will take a long time to fetch them. Miriam may be dead and eaten before we could free her. Let us set out at once for the village of the Gomangani. If we travel very fast, it will not take long to reach it. Then, all at the same time, we can charge into the village, growling and barking. The Gomangani will be very frightened and will run away. While they are gone, we can seize Miriam and carry her off. We do not have to kill or be killed, all that Korak wishes is his Miriam. We are too few, croaked the old ape again. Yes, we are too few, echoed others. Korak could not persuade them. They would help him, gladly, but they must do it in their own way, and that meant enlisting the services of their kinsmen and allies of the hill country. So Korak was forced to give in. All he could do for the present was to urge them to haste, and at his suggestion the king baboon with a dozen of his mightiest bulls agreed to go to the hill country with Korak, leaving the balance of the herd behind. Once enlisted in the adventure, the baboons became quite enthusiastic about it. The delegation set off immediately. They traveled swiftly, but the ape man found no difficulty in keeping up with them. They made a tremendous racket as they passed through the trees in an endeavor to suggest to enemies in their front that a great herd was approaching, for when the baboons travel in large numbers there is no jungle creature who cares to molest them. When the nature of the country required much travel upon the level, and the distance between trees was great, they moved silently, knowing that the lion and the leopard would not be fooled by noise when they could see plainly for themselves that only a handful of baboons were on the trail. For 2 days the party raced through the savage country, passing out of the dense jungle into an open plain, and across this to timbered mountain slopes. Here Korak never before had been. It was a new country to him, and the change from the monotony of the circumscribed view in the jungle was pleasing. But he had little desire to enjoy the beauties of nature at this time. Miriam, his Miriam, was in danger. Until she was freed and returned to him, he had little thought for aught else. Once in the forest that clothed the mountain slopes, the baboons advanced more slowly. Constantly they gave tongue to a plaintive note of calling. Then would follow silence while they listened. At last, faintly from the distance straight ahead came an answer. The baboons continued to travel in the direction of the voices that floated through the forest to them in the intervals of their own silence. Thus, calling and listening, they came closer to their kinsmen, who, it was evident to Korak, were coming to meet them in great numbers. But when, at last, the baboons of the hill country came in view, the ape man was staggered at the reality that broke upon his vision. What appeared a solid wall of huge baboons rose from the ground through the branches of the trees to the loftiest terrace to which they dared entrust their weight. Slowly they were approaching, voicing their weird, plaintive call, and behind them, as far as Korak's eyes could pierce the verdure, rose solid walls of their fellows treading close upon their heels. There were thousands of them. The ape-man could not but think of the fate of his little party should some untoward incident arouse even momentarily the rage of fear of a single one of all these thousands. But nothing such befell. The two kings approached one another, as was their custom, with much sniffing and bristling. They satisfied themselves of each other's identity. Then each scratched the other's back. After a moment they spoke together. Korak's friend explained the nature of their visit, and for the first time Korak showed himself. He had been hiding behind a bush. The excitement among the hill baboons was intense at sight of him. For a moment Korak feared that he should be torn to pieces, but his fear was for Miriam. Should he die there would be none to succor her. The two kings, however, managed to quiet the multitude, and Korak was permitted to approach. Slowly the hill baboons came closer to him. They sniffed at him from every angle. When he spoke to them in their own tongue they were filled with wonder and delight. They talked to him and listened while he spoke. He told them of Miriam, and of their life in the jungle where they were the friends of all the ape folk from Little Mana to Mangani, the great ape. The Gomangani, who are keeping Miriam from me, are no friends of yours, he said. They kill you. The baboons of the low country are too few to go against them. They tell me that you are very many and very brave, that your numbers are as the numbers of the grasses upon the plains or the leaves within the forest, and that even Tanta, the elephant, fears you, so brave you are. They told me that you would be happy to accompany us to the village of the Gomangani and punish these bad people while I, Korak, the killer, carry away my Miriam. The king ape puffed out his chest and strutted about very stiff-legged indeed. So also did many of the other great bulls of his nation. They were pleased and flattered by the words of the strange Tomangani, who called himself Mangani and spoke the language of the hairy progenitors of man. Yes, said one, we of the hill country are mighty fighters. Tanta fears us. Numa fears us. Shieta fears us. The Gomangani of the hill country are glad to pass us by in peace. I, for one, will come with you to the village of the Gomangani of the low places. I am the king's first he-child. Alone can I kill all the Gomangani of the low country, and he swelled his chest and strutted proudly back and forth, until the itching back of a comrade commanded his industrious attention. I am Goob, cried another. My fighting fangs are long. They are sharp. They are strong. Into the soft flesh of many a Gomangani have they been buried. Alone I slew the sister of Shieta. Goob will go to the low country with you and kill so many of the Gomangani that there will be none left to count the dead, and then he, too, strutted and pranced before the admiring eyes of the shes and the young. Korak looked at the king, questioningly. Your bulls are very brave, he said, but braver than any is the king. Thus addressed, the shaggy bull, still in his prime else he had been no longer king, growled ferociously. The forest echoed to his lusty challenges. The little baboons clutched fearfully at their mothers' hairy necks. The bulls, electrified, leaped high in air and took up the roaring challenge of their king. The din was terrific. Korak came close to the king and shouted in his ear, "Come." Then he started off through the forest toward the plain that they must cross on their long journey back to the village of Kavudu, the Gomangani. The king, still roaring and shrieking, wheeled and followed him. In their wake came the handful of low country baboons and the thousands of the hill clan, savage, wiry, dog-like creatures, athirst for blood. And so they came, upon the second day, to the village of Kavudu. It was mid-afternoon. The village was sunk in the quiet of the great equatorial sun heat. The mighty herd travelled quietly now. Beneath the thousands of padded feet the forest gave forth no greater sound than might have been produced by the increased soughing of a stronger breeze through the leafy branches of the trees. Korak and the two kings were in the lead. Close beside the village they halted until the stragglers had closed up. Now utter silence reigned. Korak, creeping stealthily, entered the tree that overhung the palisade. He glanced behind him. The pack were close upon his heels. The time had come. He had warned them continuously during the long march that no harm must befall the white she who lay a prisoner within the village. All others were their legitimate prey. Then, raising his face toward the sky, he gave voice to a single cry. It was the signal. In response, 3,000 hairy bulls leaped screaming and barking into the village of the terrified blacks. Warriors poured from every hut. Mothers gathered their babies in their arms and fled toward the gates as they saw the horrid horde pouring into the village street. Kovudu marshaled his fighting men about him and, leaping and yelling to arouse their courage, offered a bristling, spear-tipped front to the charging horde. Korak, as he had led the march, led the charge. The blacks were struck with horror and dismay at the sight of this white-skinned youth at the head of a pack of hideous baboons. For an instant they held their ground, hurling their spears once at the advancing multitude, but before they could fit arrows to their bows they wavered, gave, and turned in terrified rout. Into their ranks, upon their backs, sinking strong fangs into the muscles of their necks sprang the baboons, and first among them, most ferocious, most bloodthirsty, most terrible was Korak, the killer. At the village gates, through which the blacks poured in panic, Korak left them to the tender mercies of his allies and turned himself eagerly toward the hut in which Miriam had been a prisoner. It was empty. One after another the filthy interiors revealed the same disheartening fact: Miriam was in none of them. That she had not been taken by the blacks in their flight from the village Korak knew, for he had watched carefully for a glimpse of her among the fugitives. To the mind of the ape-man, knowing as he did the proclivities of the savages, there was but a single explanation: Miriam had been killed and eaten. With the conviction that Miriam was dead there surged through Korak's brain a wave of blood-red rage against those he believed to be her murderer. In the distance he could hear the snarling of the baboons mixed with the screams of their victims, and towards this he made his way. When he came upon them the baboons had commenced to tire of the sport of battle, and the blacks in a little knot were making a new stand, using their knob sticks effectively upon the few bulls who still persisted in attacking them. Among these broke Korak from the branches of a tree above them, swift, relentless, terrible. He hurled himself upon the savage warriors of Kovudu. Blind fury possessed him. Too, it protected him by its very ferocity. Like a wounded lioness he was here, there, everywhere, striking terrific blows with hard fists and with the precision and timeliness of the trained fighter. Again and again he buried his teeth in the flesh of a foeman. He was upon one and gone again to another before an effective blow could be dealt him. Yet, though great was the weight of his execution in determining the result of the combat, it was outweighed by the terror which he inspired in the simple, superstitious minds of his foemen. To them this white warrior, who consorted with the great apes and the fierce baboons, who growled and snarled and snapped like a beast, was not human. He was a demon of the forest, a fearsome god of evil whom they had offended, and who had come out of his lair deep in the jungle to punish them. And because of this belief there were many who offered but little defense, feeling as they did the futility of pitting their puny mortal strength against that of a deity. Those who could fled, until at last there were no more to pay the penalty for a deed, which, while not beyond them, they were, nevertheless, not guilty of. Panting and bloody, Korak paused for want of further victims. The baboons gathered about him, sated themselves with blood and battle. They lolled upon the ground, fagged. In the distance Kovudu was gathering his scattered tribesmen, and taking account of injuries and losses. His people were panic-stricken. Nothing could prevail upon them to remain longer in this country. They would not even return to the village for their belongings. Instead they insisted upon continuing their flight until they had put many miles between themselves and the stamping ground of the demon who had so bitterly attacked them. And thus it befell that Korak drove from their homes the only people who might have aided him in a search for Miriam, and cut off the only connecting link between him and her from whomsoever might come in search of him from the doer of the kindly Bwana who had befriended his little jungle sweetheart. It was a sour and savage Korak who bade farewell to his baboon allies upon the following morning. They wished him to accompany him, but the ape-man had no heart for the society of any. Jungle life had encouraged taciturnity in him. His sorrow had deepened this to a sullen moroseness that could not brook even the savage companionship of the ill-natured baboons. Brooding and despondent, he took his solitary way into the deepest jungle. He moved along the ground when he knew that Numa was abroad and hungry. He took to the same trees that harbored Shieta, the panther. He courted death in 100 ways and 100 forms. His mind was ever occupied with reminiscences of Miriam and the happy years that they had spent together. He realized now to the full what she had meant to him. The sweet face, the tanned, supple, little body, the bright smile that always had welcomed his return from the hunt haunted him continually. Inaction soon threatened him with madness. He must be on the go. He must fill his days with labor and excitement that he might forget, that night might find him so exhausted that he should sleep in blessed unconsciousness of his misery until a new day had come. Had he guessed that by any possibility Miriam might still live, he would at least have had hope. His days could have been devoted to searching for her, but he implicitly believed that she was dead. For a long year he led his solitary, roaming life. Occasionally he fell in with Akut and his tribe, hunting with them for a day or two, or he might travel to the hill country where the baboons had come to accept him as a matter of course, but most of all was he with Tanta, the elephant, the great grey battleship of the jungle, the super-dreadnought of his savage world. The peaceful quiet of the monster bulls, the watchful solicitude of the mother cows, the awkward playfulness of the calves rested, interested, and amused Korak. The life of the huge beasts took his mind, temporarily, from his own grief. He came to love them as he loved not even the great apes, and there was one gigantic tusker in particular of which he was very fond, the lord of the herd, a savage beast that was wont to charge a stranger upon the slightest provocation, or upon no provocation whatsoever. And to Korak this mountain of destruction was docile and affectionate as a lapdog. He came when Korak called. He wound his trunk about the ape-man's body and lifted him to his broad neck in response to a gesture, and there would Korak lie at full length, kicking his toes affectionately into the thick hide and brushing the flies from about the tender ears of his colossal chum with a leafy branch torn from a nearby tree by Tanta for the purpose. And all the while Miriam was scarce 100 miles away. Chapter 16. To Miriam, in her new home, the days passed quickly. At first she was all anxiety to be off into the jungle searching for her Korak. Bwana, as she insisted upon calling her benefactor, dissuaded her from making the attempt at once by dispatching a headman with a party of blacks to Kavudu's village with instructions to learn from the old savage how he came into possession of the white girl and as much of her antecedents as might be culled from the black chieftain. Bwana particularly charged his headman with the duty of questioning Kavudu relative to the strange character whom the girl called Korak, and of searching for the ape-man if he found the slightest evidence upon which to ground a belief in the existence of such an individual. Bwana was more than fully convinced that Korak was a creature of the girl's disordered imagination. He believed that the terrors and hardships she had undergone during captivity among the blacks and her frightful experience with the two Swedes had unbalanced her mind, but as the days passed and he became better acquainted with her and able to observe her under the ordinary conditions of the quiet of his African home, he was forced to admit that her strange tale puzzled him not a little, for there was no other evidence whatever that Miriam was not in full possession of her normal faculties. The white man's wife, whom Miriam had christened my dear from having first heard her thus addressed by Bwana, took not only a deep interest in the little jungle waif because of her forlorn and friendless state, but grew to love her as well for her sunny disposition and natural charm of temperament. And Miriam, similarly impressed by little attributes in the gentle, cultured woman, reciprocated the other's regard and affection. And so the days flew by while Miriam waited the return of the headman and his party from the country of Kavudu. They were short days, for into them were crowded many hours of insidious instruction of the unlettered child by the lonely woman. She commenced at once to teach the girl English without forcing it upon her as a task. She varied the instruction with lessons in sewing and deportment, nor once did she let Mariam guess that it was not all play. Nor was this difficult, since the girl was avid to learn. Then there were pretty dresses to be made to take the place of the single leopard skin, and in this she found the child as responsive and enthusiastic as any civilized miss of her acquaintance. A month passed before the headman returned, a month that had transformed the savage, half-naked little Tumangani into a daintily frocked girl of at least outward civilization. Mariam had progressed rapidly with the intricacies of the English language, for Bwana and my dear had persistently refused to speak Arabic from the time they had decided that Mariam must learn English, which had been a day or two after her introduction into their home. The report of the headman plunged Mariam into a period of despondency, for he had found the village of Kavudu deserted, nor, search as he would, could he discover a single native anywhere in the vicinity. For some time he had camped near the village, spending the days in a systematic search of the environs for traces of Mariam's Korak, but in this quest, too, had he failed. He had seen neither apes nor ape man. Mariam at first insisted upon setting forth herself in search of Korak, but Bwana prevailed upon her to wait. He would go himself, he assured her, as soon as he could find the time, and at last Mariam consented to abide by his wishes, but it was months before she ceased to mourn almost hourly for her Korak. My dear grieved with the grieving girl and did her best to comfort and cheer her. She told her that if Korak lived he would find her, but all the time she believed that Korak had never existed beyond the child's dreams. She planned amusements to distract Mariam's attention from her sorrow, and she instituted a well-designed campaign to impress upon the child the desirability of civilized life and customs. Nor was this difficult, as she was soon to learn, for it rapidly became evident that beneath the uncouth savagery of the girl was a bedrock of innate refinement, a nicety of taste and predilection that quite equaled that of her instructor. My dear was delighted. She was lonely and childless, and so she lavished upon this little stranger all the mother love that would have gone to her own had she had won. The result was that by the end of the first year none might have guessed that Mariam ever had existed beyond the lap of culture and luxury. She was 16 now, though she easily might have passed for 19, and she was very good to look upon, with her black hair and her tan skin and all the freshness and purity of health and innocence. Yet she still nursed her secret sorrow, though she no longer mentioned it to my dear. Scarce an hour passed that did not bring its recollection of Korak, and its poignant yearning to see him again. Mariam spoke English fluently now, and read and wrote it as well. One day my dear spoke jokingly to her in French, and to her surprise Mariam replied in the same tongue, slowly, it is true, and haltingly, but none the less in excellent French, such, though, as a little child might use. Thereafter they spoke a little French each day, and my dear often marveled that the girl learned this language with a facility that was at times almost uncanny. At first Mariam had puckered her narrow, arched, little eyebrows as though trying to force recollection of something all but forgotten which the new words suggested, and then, to her own astonishment as well as to that of her teacher, she had used other French words than those in the lessons, used them properly and with a pronunciation that the Englishwoman knew was more perfect than her own. But Mariam could neither read nor write what she spoke so well, and as my dear considered a knowledge of correct English of the first importance, other than conversational French, was postponed for a later day. You doubtless heard French spoken at times in your father's douar, suggested my dear, as the most reasonable explanation. Mariam shook her head. It may be, she said, but I do not recall ever having seen a Frenchman in my father's company. He hated them and would have nothing whatever to do with them, and I am quite sure that I never heard any of these words before, yet at the same time I find them all familiar. I cannot understand it. Neither can I, agreed my dear. It was about this time that a runner brought a letter that, when she learned the contents, filled Mariam with excitement. Visitors were coming. A number of English ladies and gentlemen had accepted my dear's invitation to spend a month of hunting and exploring with them. Mariam was all expectancy. What would these strangers be like? Would they be as nice to her as had Bwana and my dear, or would they be like the other white folk she had known, cruel and relentless? My dear assured her that they all were gentle folk and that she would find them kind, considerate and honorable. To my dear's surprise there was none of the shyness of the wild creature in Miriam's anticipation of the visit of strangers. She looked forward to their coming with curiosity and with a certain pleasurable anticipation when once she was assured that they would not bite her. In fact, she appeared no different than would any pretty young miss who had learned of the expected coming of company. Korak's image was still often in her thoughts, but it aroused now a less well-defined sense of bereavement. A quiet sadness pervaded Miriam when she thought of him, but the poignant grief of her loss when it was young no longer goaded her to desperation. Yet she was still loyal to him. She still hoped that someday he would find her, nor did she doubt for a moment but that he was searching for her if he still lived. It was this last suggestion that caused her the greatest perturbation. Korak might be dead. It scarce seemed possible that one so well equipped to meet the emergencies of jungle life should have succumbed so young, yet when she had last seen him he had been beset by a horde of armed warriors, and should he have returned to the village again, as she well knew he must have, he may have been killed. Even her Korak could not, single-handed, slay an entire tribe. At last the visitors arrived. There were 3 men and 2 women, the wives of the 2 older men. The youngest member of the party was Honourable Morrison Baines, a young man of considerable wealth who, having exhausted all the possibilities for pleasure offered by the capitals of Europe, had gladly seized upon this opportunity to turn to another continent for excitement and adventure. He looked upon all things European as rather more than less impossible, still he was not at all averse to enjoying the novelty of unaccustomed places, and making the most of strangers indigenous thereto, however unspeakable they might have seemed to him at home. In manner he was suave and courteous to all, if possible a trifle more punctilious toward those he considered of meaner clay than toward the few he mentally admitted to equality. Nature had favored him with a splendid physique and a handsome face, and also with sufficient good judgment to appreciate that while he might enjoy the contemplation of his superiority to the masses, there was little likelihood of the masses being equally entranced by the same cause. And so he easily maintained the reputation of being a most democratic and likable fellow, and indeed he was likable. Just a shade of his egotism was occasionally apparent, never sufficient to become a burden to his associates. And this, briefly, was the Honourable Morrison Baines of luxurious European civilization. What would be the Honourable Morrison Baines of Central Africa it were difficult to guess. Miriam, at first, was shy and reserved in the presence of the strangers. Her benefactors had seen fit to ignore mention of her strange past, and so she passed as their ward whose antecedents not having been mentioned were not to be inquired into. The guests found her sweet and unassuming, laughing, vivacious and a never-exhausted storehouse of quaint and interesting jungle lore. She had ridden much during her year with Bwana and my dear. She knew each favorite clump of concealing reeds along the river that the buffalo loved best. She knew a dozen places where lions led, and every drinking hole in the drier country 25 miles back from the river. With unerring precision that was almost uncanny she could track the largest or the smallest beast to his hiding place. But the thing that baffled them all was her instant consciousness of the presence of carnivora that others, exerting their faculties to the utmost, could neither see nor hear. The Honourable Morrison Baines found Miriam a most beautiful and charming companion. He was delighted with her from the first. Particularly so, it is possible, because he had not thought to find companionship of this sort upon the African estate of his London friends. They were together a great deal as they were the only unmarried couple in the little company. Miriam, entirely unaccustomed to the companionship of such as Baines, was fascinated by him. His tales of the great, gay cities with which he was familiar filled her with admiration and with wonder. If the Honourable Morrison always shone to advantage in these narratives, Miriam saw in that fact but a most natural consequence to his presence upon the scene of his story. Wherever Morrison might be he must be a hero, so thought the girl. With the actual presence and companionship of the young Englishman the image of Korak became less real. Where before it had been an actuality to her, she now realized that Korak was but a memory. To that memory she still was loyal, but what weight has a memory in the presence of a fascinating reality? Miriam had never accompanied the men upon a hunt since the arrival of the guests. She never had cared particularly for the sport of killing. The tracking she enjoyed, but the mere killing for the sake of killing she could not find pleasure in, little savage that she had been, and still, to some measure, was. When Bwana had gone forth to shoot for meat she had always been his enthusiastic companion, but with the coming of the London guests the hunting had deteriorated into mere killing. Slaughter the host would not permit, yet the purpose of the hunts were for heads and skins and not for food. So Miriam remained behind and spent her days either with my dear upon the shaded veranda, or riding her favourite pony across the plains or to the forest edge. Here she would leave him untethered while she took to the trees for the moment's unalloyed pleasures of a return to the wild, free existence of her earlier childhood. Then would come again visions of Korak, and, tired at last of leaping and swinging through the trees, she would stretch herself comfortably upon a branch and dream. And presently, as today, she found the features of Korak slowly dissolve and merge into those of another, and the figure of a tanned, half-naked Tarmangani become a khaki-clothed Englishman astride a hunting pony. And while she dreamed there came to her ears from a distance, faintly, the terrified bleating of a kid. Miriam was instantly alert. You or I, even had we been able to hear the pitiful wail at so great distance, could not have interpreted it, but to Miriam it meant a species of terror that afflicts the ruminant when a carnivore is near and escape impossible. It had been both a pleasure and a sport of Korak's to rob Numa of his prey whenever possible, and Miriam too had often joyed in the thrill of snatching some dainty morsel almost from the very jaws of the king of beasts. Now, at the sound of the kid's bleat, all the well-remembered thrills recurred. Instantly she was all excitement to play again the game of hide and seek with death. Quickly she loosened her riding skirt and tossed it aside. It was a heavy handicap to successful travel in the trees. Her boots and stockings followed the skirt, for the bare sole of the human foot does not slip upon dry or even wet bark as does the hard leather of a boot. She would have liked to discard her riding breeches also, but the motherly admonitions of my dear had convinced Miriam that it was not good form to go naked through the world. At her hip hung a hunting knife. Her rifle was still in its boot at her pony's withers. Her revolver she had not brought. The kid was still bleating as Miriam started rapidly in its direction, which she knew was straight toward a certain water hole which had once been famous as a rendezvous for lions. Of late there had been no evidence of carnivora in the neighborhood of this drinking place, but Miriam was positive that the bleating of the kid was due to the presence of either lion or panther. But she would soon know, for she was rapidly approaching the terrified animal. She wondered as she hastened onward that the sounds continued to come from the same point. Why did the kid not run away? And then she came in sight of the little animal and knew. The kid was tethered to a stake beside the water hole. Miriam paused in the branches of a nearby tree and scanned the surrounding clearing with quick, penetrating eyes. Where was the hunter? Bwana and his people did not hunt thus. Who could have tethered this poor little beast as a law to Numa? Bwana never countenanced such acts in his country, and his word was law among those who hunted within a radius of many miles of his estate. Some wandering savages, doubtless, thought Miriam, but where were they? Not even her keen eyes could discover them. And where was Numa? Why had he not long since sprung upon this delicious and defenseless morsel? That he was close by was attested by the pitiful crying of the kid. Ah! Now she saw him. He was lying close in a clump of brush a few yards to her right. The kid was downwind from him and getting the full benefit of his terrorizing scent, which did not reach Miriam. To circle to the opposite side of the clearing where the trees approached closer to the kid. To leap quickly to the little animal's side and cut the tether that held him would be the work of but a moment. In that moment Numa might charge, and then there would be scarce time to regain the safety of the trees, yet it might be done. Miriam had escaped from closer quarters than that many times before. The doubt that gave her momentary pause was caused by fear of the unseen hunters more than by fear of Numa. If they were stranger blacks, the spears that they held in readiness for Numa might as readily be loosed upon whomever dared release their bait as upon the prey they sought thus to trap. Again the kid struggled to be free. Again his piteous wail touched the tender heartstrings of the girl. Tossing discretion aside, she commenced to circle the clearing. Only from Numa did she attempt to conceal her presence. At last she reached the opposite trees. An instant she paused to look toward the great lion, and at the same moment she saw the huge beast rise slowly to his full height. A low roar betokened that he was ready. Miriam loosened her knife and leaped to the ground. A quick run brought her to the side of the kid. Numa saw her. He lashed his tail against his tawny sides. He roared terribly, but, for an instant, he remained where he stood, surprised into inaction, doubtless, by the strange apparition that had sprung so unexpectedly from the jungle. Other eyes were upon Miriam, 2 eyes in which were no less surprise than that reflected in the yellow-green orbs of the carnivore. A white man, hiding in a thorn boma, half rose as the young girl leaped into the clearing and dashed toward the kid. He saw Numa hesitate. He raised his rifle and covered the beast's breast. The girl reached the kid's side. Her knife flashed, and the little prisoner was free. With a parting bleat it dashed off into the jungle. Then the girl turned to retreat toward the safety of the tree from which she had dropped so suddenly and unexpectedly into the surprised view of the lion, the kid, and the man. As she turned, the girl's face was turned toward the hunter. His eyes went wide as he saw her features. He gave a little gasp of surprise, but now the lion demanded all his attention. The baffled, angry beast was charging. His breast was still covered by the motionless rifle. The man could have fired and stopped the charge at once, but for some reason, since he had seen the girl's face, he hesitated. Could it be that he did not care to save her? Or, did he prefer, if possible, to remain unseen by her? It must have been the latter cause which kept the trigger finger of the steady hand from exerting the little pressure that would have brought the great beast to at least a temporary pause. Like an eagle, the man watched the race for life the girl was making. A second or two measured the time which the whole exciting event consumed from the moment that the lion broke into his charge. Nor once did the rifle sights fail to cover the broad breast of the tawny sire as the lion's course took him a little to the man's left. Once, at the very last moment, when escape seemed impossible, the hunter's finger tightened ever so little upon the trigger, but almost coincidentally the girl leaped for an overhanging branch and seized it. The lion leaped too, but the nimble Miriam had swung herself beyond his reach without a second or an inch to spare. The man breathed a sigh of relief as he lowered his rifle. He saw the girl fling a grimace at the angry, roaring man-eater beneath her, and then, laughing, speed away into the forest. For an hour the lion remained about the water hole. 100 times could the hunter have bagged his prey. Why did he fail to do so? Was he afraid that the shot might attract the girl and cause her to return? At last Numa, still roaring angrily, strode majestically into the jungle. The hunter crawled from his boma, and half an hour later was entering a little camp snugly hidden in the forest. A handful of black followers greeted his return with sullen indifference. He was a great bearded man, a huge, yellow-bearded giant, when he entered his tent. Half an hour later he emerged smooth-shaven. His blacks looked at him in astonishment. "Would you know me?" he asked. "The hyena that bore you would not know you, Bwana," replied one. The man aimed a heavy fist at the black's face, but long experience in dodging similar blows saved the presumptuous one. Chapter 17. Miriam returned slowly toward the tree in which she had left her skirt, her shoes, and her stockings. She was singing blithely, but her song came to a sudden stop when she came within sight of the tree, for there, disporting themselves with glee and pulling and hauling upon her belongings, were a number of baboons. When they saw her they showed no signs of terror. Instead they bared their fangs and growled at her. What was there to fear in a single she-Tarmangani? Nothing, absolutely nothing. In the open plain beyond the forest the hunters were returning from the day's sport. They were widely separated, hoping to raise a wandering lion on the homeward journey across the plain. The Honourable Morrison Baines rode closest to the forest. As his eyes wandered back and forth across the undulating, shrub-sprinkled ground they fell upon the form of a creature close beside the thick jungle where it terminated abruptly at the plain's edge. He reined his mount in the direction of his discovery. It was yet too far away for his untrained eyes to recognize it, but as he came closer he saw that it was a horse, and was about to resume the original direction of his way when he thought that he discerned a saddle upon the beast's back. He rode a little closer. Yes, the animal was saddled. The Honourable Morrison approached yet nearer, and as he did so his eyes expressed a pleasurable emotion of anticipation, for they had now recognized the pony as the special favourite of Miriam. He galloped to the animal's side. Miriam must be within the wood. The man shuddered a little at the thought of an unprotected girl alone in the jungle that was still, to him, a fearful place of terrors and stealthily stalking death. He dismounted and left his horse beside Miriam's. On foot he entered the jungle. He knew that she was probably safe enough and he wished to surprise her by coming suddenly upon her. He had gone but a short distance into the wood when he heard a great jabbering in a nearby tree. Coming closer he saw a band of baboons snarling over something. Looking intently he saw that one of them held a woman's riding skirt and that others had boots and stockings. His heart almost ceased to beat as he quite naturally placed the most direful explanation upon the scene. The baboons had killed Miriam and stripped this clothing from her body. Morrison shuddered. He was about to call aloud in the hope that after all the girl still lived when he saw her in a tree close beside that was occupied by the baboons, and now he saw that they were snarling and jabbering at her. To his amazement he saw the girl swing, ape-like, into the tree below the huge beasts. He saw her pause upon a branch a few feet from the nearest baboon. He was about to raise his rifle and put a bullet through the hideous creature that seemed about to leap upon her when he heard the girl speak. He almost dropped his rifle from surprise as a strange jabbering, identical with that of the apes, broke from Miriam's lips. The baboons stopped their snarling and listened. It was quite evident that they were as much surprised as the Honourable Morrison Baines. Slowly and one by one they approached the girl. She gave not the slightest evidence of fear of them. They quite surrounded her now so that Baines could not have fired without endangering the girl's life, but he no longer desired to fire. He was consumed with curiosity. For several minutes the girl carried on what could be nothing less than a conversation with the baboons, and then with seeming alacrity every article of her apparel in their possession was handed over to her. The baboons still crowded eagerly about her as she donned them. They chattered to her and she chattered back. The Honourable Morrison Baines sat down at the foot of a tree and mopped his perspiring brow. Then he rose and made his way back to his mount. When Miriam emerged from the forest a few minutes later she found him there, and he eyed her with wide eyes in which were both wonder and a sort of terror. "I saw your horse here," he explained, "and thought that I would wait and ride home with you. You do not mind?" "Of course not," she replied. "It will be lovely." As they made their way stirrup to stirrup across the plain the Honourable Morrison caught himself many times watching the girl's regular profile and wondering if his eyes had deceived him or if, in truth, he really had seen this lovely creature consorting with grotesque baboons and conversing with them as fluently as she conversed with him. The thing was uncanny, impossible, yet he had seen it with his own eyes. And as he watched her another thought persisted in obtruding itself into his mind. She was most beautiful and very desirable, but what did he know of her? Was she not altogether impossible? Was the scene that he had but just witnessed not sufficient proof of her impossibility? A woman who climbed trees and conversed with the baboons of the jungle. It was quite horrible. Again the Honourable Morrison mopped his brow. Miriam glanced toward him. "You are warm," she said. Now that the sun is setting, I find it quite cool. Why do you perspire now? He had not intended to let her know that he had seen her with the baboons, but quite suddenly, before he realized what he was saying, he had blurted it out. I perspire from emotion, he said. I went into the jungle when I discovered your pony. I wanted to surprise you, but it was I who was surprised. I saw you in the trees with the baboons. Yes, she said quite unemotionally, as though it was a matter of little moment that a young girl should be upon intimate terms with savage jungle beasts. It was horrible, ejaculated the Honourable Morrison. Horrible, repeated Miriam, puckering her brows in bewilderment. What was horrible about it? They are my friends. Is it horrible to talk with one's friends? You are really talking with them, then, cried the Honourable Morrison. You understood them and they understood you. Certainly. But they are hideous creatures, degraded beasts of a lower order. How could you speak the language of beasts? They are not hideous, and they are not degraded, replied Miriam. Friends are never that. I lived among them for years before Bwana found me and brought me here. I scarce knew any other tongue than that of the Mangani. Should I refuse to know them now simply because I happen, for the present, to live among humans? For the present, ejaculated the Honourable Morrison. You cannot mean that you expect to return to live among them. Come, come, what foolishness are we talking? The very idea. You are spoofing me, Miss Miriam. You have been kind to these baboons here and they know you and do not molest you, but that you once lived among them, no. That is preposterous. But I did, though, insisted the girl, seeing the real horror that the man felt in the presence of such an idea reflected in his tone and manner, and rather enjoying baiting him still further. Yes, I lived, almost naked, among the great apes and the lesser apes. I dwelt among the branches of the trees. I pounced upon the smaller prey and devoured it raw. With Korak and Aht I hunted the antelope and the boar. And I sat upon a tree limb and made faces at Numa, the lion, and threw sticks at him and annoyed him until he roared so terribly in his rage that the earth shook. And Korak built me a lair high among the branches of a mighty tree. He brought me fruits and flesh. He fought for me and was kind to me until I came to Bwana, and my dear, I do not recall that any other than Korak was ever kind to me. There was a wistful note in the girl's voice now, and she had forgotten that she was bantering the Honourable Morrison. She was thinking of Korak. She had not thought of him a great deal of late. For a time both were silently absorbed in their own reflections as they rode on toward the bungalow of their host. The girl was thinking of a godlike figure, a leopard skin half concealing his smooth, brown hide as he leaped nimbly through the trees to lay an offering of food before her on his return from a successful hunt. Behind him, shaggy and powerful, swung a huge anthropoid ape, while she, Miriam, laughing and shouting her welcome, swung upon a swaying limb before the entrance to her sylvan bower. It was a pretty picture as she recalled it. The other side seldom obtruded itself upon her memory, the long, black nights, the chill, terrible jungle nights, the cold and damp and discomfort of the rainy season, the hideous mouthings of the savage carnivora as they prowled through the Stygian darkness beneath, the constant menace of Shieta, the panther, and Hista, the snake, the stinging insects, the loathsome vermin. For, in truth, all these had been outweighed by the happiness of the sunny days, the freedom of it all, and, most, the companionship of Korak. The man's thoughts were rather jumbled. He had suddenly realized that he had come mighty near falling in love with this girl of whom he had known nothing up to the previous moment when she had voluntarily revealed a portion of her past to him. The more he thought upon the matter, the more evident it became to him that he had given her his love, that he had been upon the verge of offering her his honorable name. He trembled a little at the narrowness of his escape. Yet, he still loved her. There was no objection to that according to the ethics of the Honourable Morrison Baines and his kind. She was a meaner clay than he. He could no more have taken her in marriage than he could have taken one of her baboon friends, nor would she, of course, expect such an offer from him. To have his love would be sufficient honor for her, his name he would, naturally, bestow upon one in his own elevated social sphere. A girl who had consorted with apes, who, according to her own admission, had lived almost naked among them, could have no considerable sense of the finer qualities of virtue. The love that he would offer her, then, would, far from offending her, probably cover all that she might desire or expect. The more the Honourable Morrison Baines thought upon the subject, the more fully convinced he became that he was contemplating a most chivalrous and unselfish act. Europeans will better understand his point of view than Americans, poor, benighted provincials, who are denied a true appreciation of caste and of the fact that the king can do no wrong. He did not even have to argue the point that she would be much happier amidst the luxuries of a London apartment, fortified as she would be by both his love and his bank account, than lawfully wed to such a one as her social position warranted. There was one question, however, which he wished to have definitely answered before he committed himself even to the program he was considering. "Who are Korak and AHT?" he asked. "AHT was a Mangani," replied Miriam, "and Korak a Tarmangani." "And what, pray, might a Mangani be, and a Tarmangani?" The girl laughed. "You are a Tarmangani," she replied. "The Mangani are covered with hair, you would call them apes." "Then Korak was a white man?" he asked. "Yes." "And he was your? He paused, for he found it rather difficult to go on with that line of questioning while the girl's clear, beautiful eyes were looking straight into his. "My what?" insisted Miriam, far too unsophisticated in her unspoiled innocence to guess what the Honourable Morrison was driving at. "Why, your brother?" he stumbled. "No, Korak was not my brother," she replied. "Was he your husband, then?" he finally blurted. Far from taking offense, Miriam broke into a merry laugh. "My husband," she cried. "Why, how old do you think I am? I am too young to have a husband. I had never thought of such a thing. Korak was, why," and now she hesitated, too, for she never before had attempted to analyze the relationship that existed between herself and Korak. Why, Korak was just Korak. And again she broke into a gay laugh as she realized the illuminating quality of her description. Looking at her and listening to her, the man beside her could not believe that depravity of any sort or degree entered into the girl's nature, yet he wanted to believe that she had not been virtuous, for otherwise his task was less a sinecure. The Honourable Morrison was not entirely without conscience. For several days the Honourable Morrison made no appreciable progress toward the consummation of his scheme. Sometimes he almost abandoned it, for he found himself time and again wondering how slight might be the provocation necessary to trick him into making a bona fide offer of marriage to Miriam if he permitted himself to fall more deeply in love with her, and it was difficult to see her daily and not love her. There was a quality about her which, all unknown to the Honourable Morrison, was making his task an extremely difficult one. It was that quality of innate goodness and cleanness which is a good girl's stoutest bulwark and protection, an impregnable barrier that only degeneracy has the effrontery to assail. The Honourable Morrison Baines would never be considered a degenerate. He was sitting with Miriam upon the veranda one evening after the others had retired. Earlier they had been playing tennis, a game in which the Honourable Morrison shone to advantage, as, in truth, he did in most all manly sports. He was telling Miriam stories of London and Paris, of balls and banquets, of the wonderful women and their wonderful gowns, of the pleasures and pastimes of the rich and powerful. The Honourable Morrison was a past master in the art of insidious boasting. His egotism was never flagrant or tiresome, he was never crude in it, for crudeness was a plebeianism that the Honourable Morrison studiously avoided, yet the impression derived by a listener to the Honourable Morrison was one that was not at all calculated to detract from the glory of the House of Baines, or from that of its representative. Miriam was entranced. His tales were like fairy stories to this little jungle maid. The Honourable Morrison loomed large and wonderful and magnificent in her mind's eye. He fascinated her, and when he drew closer to her after a short silence and took her hand, she thrilled as one might thrill beneath the touch of a deity, a thrill of exaltation not unmixed with fear. He bent his lips close to her ear. "Mariam," he whispered. "My little Mariam. May I hope to have the right to call you my little Mariam?" The girl turned wide eyes upward to his face, but it was in shadow. She trembled, but she did not draw away. The man put an arm about her and drew her closer. "I love you," he whispered. She did not reply. She did not know what to say. She knew nothing of love. She had never given it a thought, but she did know that it was very nice to be loved, whatever it meant. It was nice to have people kind to one. She had known so little of kindness or affection. "Tell me," he said, "that you return my love." His lips came steadily closer to hers. They had almost touched when a vision of Korak sprang like a miracle before her eyes. She saw Korak's face close to hers, she felt his lips hot against hers, and then for the first time in her life she guessed what love meant. She drew away, gently. "I am not sure," she said, "that I love you. Let us wait. There is plenty of time. I am too young to marry yet, and I am not sure that I should be happy in London or Paris, they rather frighten me." How easily and naturally she had connected his avowal of love with the idea of marriage. The Honourable Morrison was perfectly sure that he had not mentioned marriage, he had been particularly careful not to do so. And then she was not sure that she loved him. That, too, came rather in the nature of a shock to his vanity. It seemed incredible that this little barbarian should have any doubts whatever as to the desirability of the Honourable Morrison Baines. The first flush of passion cooled, the Honourable Morrison was enabled to reason more logically. The start had been all wrong. It would be better now to wait and prepare her mind gradually for the only proposition which his exalted estate would permit him to offer her. He would go slow. He glanced down at the girl's profile. It was bathed in the silvery light of the great tropic moon. The Honourable Morrison Baines wondered if it were to be so easy a matter to go slow. She was most alluring. Mariam rose. The vision of Korak was still before her. "Good night," she said. "It is almost too beautiful to leave." She waved her hand in a comprehensive gesture which took in the starry heavens, the great moon, the broad, silvered plain, and the dense shadows in the distance that marked the jungle. "Oh, how I love it!" "You would love London more," he said earnestly. "And London would love you. You would be a famous beauty in any capital of Europe. You would have the world at your feet, Mariam." "Good night," she repeated, and left him. The Honourable Morrison selected a cigarette from his crested case, lighted it, blew a thin line of blue smoke toward the moon, and smiled. Chapter 18. Mariam and Bwana were sitting on the veranda together the following day when a horseman appeared in the distance riding across the plain toward the bungalow. Bwana shaded his eyes with his hand and gazed out toward the oncoming rider. He was puzzled. Strangers were few in Central Africa. Even the blacks for a distance of many miles in every direction were well known to him. No white man came within 100 miles that word of his coming did not reach Bwana long before the stranger. His every move was reported to the big Bwana, just what animals he killed and how many of each species, how he killed them, too, for Bwana would not permit the use of prussic acid or strychnine, and how he treated his boys. Several European sportsmen had been turned back to the coast by the big Englishman's orders because of unwarranted cruelty to their black followers, and one, whose name had long been heralded in civilized communities as that of a great sportsman, was driven from Africa with orders never to return when Bwana found that his big bag of 14 lions had been made by the diligent use of poisoned bait. The result was that all good sportsmen and all the natives loved and respected him. His word was law where there had never been law before. There was scarce a headman from coast to coast who would not heed the big Bwana's commands in preference to those of the hunters who employed them, and so it was easy to turn back any undesirable stranger. Bwana had simply to threaten to order his boys to desert him. But there was evidently one who had slipped into the country unheralded. Bwana could not imagine who the approaching horseman might be. After the manner of frontier hospitality the globe round, he met the newcomer at the gate, welcoming him even before he had dismounted. He saw a tall, well-knit man of 30 or over, blond of hair and smooth-shaven. There was a tantalizing familiarity about him that convinced Bwana that he should be able to call the visitor by name, yet he was unable to do so. The newcomer was evidently of Scandinavian origin, both his appearance and accent denoted that. His manner was rough but open. He made a good impression upon the Englishman, who was wont to accept strangers in this wild and savage country at their own valuation, asking no questions and assuming the best of them until they proved themselves undeserving of his friendship and hospitality. "It is rather unusual that a white man comes unheralded," he said, as they walked together toward the field into which he had suggested that the traveler might turn his pony. "My friends, the natives, keep us rather well posted." "It is probably due to the fact that I came from the south," explained the stranger, "that you did not hear of my coming. I have seen no village for several marches." "No, there are none to the south of us for many miles," replied Bwana. "Since Kavudu deserted his country I rather doubt that one could find a native in that direction under 200 or 300 miles. Bwana was wondering how a lone white man could have made his way through the savage, unhospitable miles that lay toward the south. As though guessing what must be passing through the other's mind, the stranger vouchsafed an explanation. "I came down from the north to do a little trading and hunting," he said, "and got way off the beaten track. My headman, who was the only member of the safari who had ever before been in the country, took sick and died. We could find no natives to guide us, and so I simply swung back straight north. We have been living on the fruits of our guns for over a month. Didn't have an idea there was a white man within 1,000 miles of us when we camped last night by a water hole at the edge of the plain. This morning I started out to hunt and saw the smoke from your chimney, so I sent my gun bearer back to camp with the good news and rode straight over here myself. Of course I've heard of you, everybody who comes into Central Africa does, and I'd be mighty glad of permission to rest up and hunt around here for a couple of weeks." "Certainly," replied Bwana. "Move your camp up close to the river below my boys' camp and make yourself at home." They had reached the veranda now and Bwana was introducing the stranger to Miriam and my dear, who had just come from the bungalow's interior. "This is Mr. Hansen," he said, using the name the man had given him. "He is a trader who has lost his way in the jungle to the south." My dear and Miriam bowed their acknowledgments of the introduction. The man seemed rather ill at ease in their presence. His host attributed this to the fact that his guest was unaccustomed to the society of cultured women, and so found a pretext to quickly extricate him from his seemingly unpleasant position and lead him away to his study and the brandy and soda, which were evidently much less embarrassing to Mr. Hansen. When the two had left them, Miriam turned toward my dear. "It is odd," she said, "but I could almost swear that I had known Mr. Hansen in the past. It is odd, but quite impossible," and she gave the matter no further thought. Hansen did not accept Bwana's invitation to move his camp closer to the bungalow. He said his boys were inclined to be quarrelsome, and so were better off at a distance, and he, himself, was around but little, and then always avoided coming into contact with the ladies. A fact which naturally aroused only laughing comment on the rough trader's bashfulness. He accompanied the men on several hunting trips where they found him perfectly at home and well versed in all the finer points of big game hunting. Of an evening he often spent much time with the white foreman of the big farm, evidently finding in the society of this rougher man more common interests than the cultured guests of Bwana possessed for him. So it came that his was a familiar figure about the premises by night. He came and went as he saw fit, often wandering along in the great flower garden that was the especial pride and joy of my dear and Miriam. The first time that he had been surprised there he apologized gruffly, explaining that he had always been fond of the good old blooms of Northern Europe which my dear had so successfully transplanted in African soil. Was it, though, the ever-beautiful blossoms of hollyhocks and phlox that drew him to the perfumed air of the garden, or that other infinitely more beautiful flower who wandered often among the blooms beneath the great moon, the black-haired, sun-tanned Miriam? For 3 weeks Hansen had remained. During this time he said that his boys were resting and gaining strength after their terrible ordeals in the untracked jungle to the south, but he had not been as idle as he appeared to have been. He divided his small following into 2 parties, entrusting the leadership of each to men whom he believed that he could trust. To them he explained his plans and the rich reward that they would win from him if they carried his designs to a successful conclusion. One party he moved very slowly northward along the trail that connects with the great caravan routes entering the Sahara from the south. The other he ordered straight westward with orders to halt and go into permanent camp just beyond the great river which marks the natural boundary of the country that the Big Bwana rightfully considers almost his own. To his host he explained that he was moving his safari slowly toward the north. He said nothing of the party moving westward. Then, one day, he announced that half his boys had deserted, for a hunting party from the bungalow had come across his northerly camp and he feared that they might have noticed the reduced numbers of his following. And thus matters stood when, one hot night, Miriam, unable to sleep, rose and wandered out into the garden. The Honourable Morrison had been urging his suit once more that evening, and the girl's mind was in such a turmoil that she had been unable to sleep. The wide heavens about her seemed to promise a greater freedom from doubt and questioning. Baines had urged her to tell him that she loved him. A dozen times she thought that she might honestly give him the answer that he demanded. Korak fast was becoming but a memory. That he was dead she had come to believe, since otherwise he would have sought her out. She did not know that he had even better reason to believe her dead, and that it was because of that belief he had made no effort to find her after his raid upon the village of Kavudu. Behind a great flowering shrub Hansen lay gazing at the stars and waiting. He had lain thus and there many nights before. For what was he waiting, or for whom? He heard the girl approaching, and half raised himself to his elbow. A dozen paces away, the reins looped over a fence post, stood his pony. Miriam, walking slowly, approached the bush behind which the waiter lay. Hansen drew a large bandana handkerchief from his pocket and rose stealthily to his knees. A pony neighed down at the corrals. Far out across the plain a lion roared. Hansen changed his position until he squatted upon both feet, ready to come erect quickly. Again the pony neighed, this time closer. There was the sound of his body brushing against shrubbery. Hansen heard and wondered how the animal had gotten from the corral, for it was evident that he was already in the garden. The man turned his head in the direction of the beast. What he saw sent him to the ground. Huddled close beneath the shrubbery a man was coming, leading 2 ponies. Miriam heard now and stopped to look and listen. A moment later the Honourable Morrison Baines drew near, the 2 saddled mounts at his heels. Miriam looked up at him in surprise. The Honourable Morrison grinned sheepishly. "I couldn't sleep," he explained, "and was going for a bit of a ride when I chanced to see you out here, and I thought you'd like to join me. Ripping good sport, you know, night riding. Come on." Miriam laughed. The adventure appealed to her. "All right," she said. Hansen swore beneath his breath. The 2 led their horses from the garden to the gate and through it. There they discovered Hansen's mount. "Why, here's the trader's pony," remarked Baines. "He's probably down visiting with the foreman," said Miriam. "Pretty late for him, isn't it?" remarked the Honourable Morrison. "I'd hate to have to ride back through that jungle at night to his camp." As though to give weight to his apprehensions the distant lion roared again. The Honourable Morrison shivered and glanced at the girl to note the effect of the uncanny sound upon her. She appeared not to have noticed it. A moment later the 2 had mounted and were moving slowly across the moon-bathed plain. The girl turned her pony's head straight toward the jungle. It was in the direction of the roaring of the hungry lion. "Hadn't we better steer clear of that fellow?" suggested the Honorable Morrison. "I guess you didn't hear him." "Yes, I heard him," laughed Miriam. "Let's ride over and call on him." The Honorable Morrison laughed uneasily. He didn't care to appear at a disadvantage before this girl, nor did he care, either, to approach a hungry lion too closely at night. He carried his rifle in his saddle boot, but moonlight is an uncertain light to shoot by, nor ever had he faced a lion alone even by day. The thought gave him a distinct nausea. The beast ceased his roaring now. They heard him no more, and the Honorable Morrison gained courage accordingly. They were riding downwind toward the jungle. The lion lay in a little swale to their right. He was old. For 2 nights he had not fed, for no longer was his charge as swift or his spring as mighty as in the days of his prime when he spread terror among the creatures of his wild domain. For 2 nights and days he had gone empty, and for long time before that he had fed only upon carrion. He was old, but he was yet a terrible engine of destruction. At the edge of the forest the Honorable Morrison drew rein. He had no desire to go further. Numa, silent upon his padded feet, crept into the jungle beyond them. The wind, now, was blowing gently between him and his intended prey. He had come a long way in search of man, for even in his youth he had tasted human flesh, and while it was poor stuff by comparison with eland and zebra, it was less difficult to kill. In Numa's estimation man was a slow-witted, slow-footed creature which commanded no respect unless accompanied by the acrid odor which spelled to the monarch's sensitive nostrils the great noise and the blinding flash of an express rifle. He caught the dangerous scent tonight, but he was ravenous to madness. He would face a dozen rifles, if necessary, to fill his empty belly. He circled about into the forest that he might again be downwind from his victims, for should they get his scent he could not hope to overtake them. Numa was famished, but he was old and crafty. Deep in the jungle another caught faintly the scent of man and of Numa both. He raised his head and sniffed. He cocked it upon one side and listened. "Come on," said Miriam, "let's ride in away. The forest is wonderful at night. It is open enough to permit us to ride." The Honorable Morrison hesitated. He shrank from revealing his fear in the presence of the girl. A braver man, sure of his own position, would have had the courage to have refused uselessly to expose the girl to danger. He would not have thought of himself at all, but the egotism of the Honorable Morrison required that he think always of self first. He had planned the ride to get Miriam away from the bungalow. He wanted to talk to her alone and far enough away so should she take offense at his purposed suggestion he would have time in which to attempt to right himself in her eyes before they reached home. He had little doubt, of course, but that he should succeed, but it is to his credit that he did have some slight doubts. "You needn't be afraid of the lion," said Miriam, noting his slight hesitancy. "There hasn't been a man-eater around here for 2 years, Bwana says, and the game is so plentiful that there is no necessity to drive Numa to human flesh. Then, he has been so often hunted that he rather keeps out of man's way." "Oh, I'm not afraid of lions," replied the Honorable Morrison. "I was just thinking what a beastly uncomfortable place a forest is to ride in. What with the underbrush and the low branches and all that, you know, it's not exactly cut out for pleasure riding." "Let's go afoot then," suggested Miriam, and started to dismount. "Oh, no," cried the Honorable Morrison, aghast at this suggestion. "Let's ride," and he reined his pony into the dark shadows of the wood. Behind him came Miriam, and in front, prowling ahead waiting a favorable opportunity, skulked Numa, the lion. Out upon the plain a lone horseman muttered a low curse as he saw the two disappear from sight. It was Hansen. He had followed them from the bungalow. Their way led in the direction of his camp, so he had a ready and plausible excuse should they discover him, but they had not seen him for they had not turned their eyes behind. Now he turned directly toward the spot at which they had entered the jungle. He no longer cared whether he was observed or not. There were two reasons for his indifference. The first was that he saw in Baines' act a counterpart of his own planned abduction of the girl. In some way he might turn the thing to his own purposes. At least he would keep in touch with them and make sure that Baines did not get her. His other reason was based on his knowledge of an event that had transpired at his camp the previous night, an event which he had not mentioned at the bungalow for fear of drawing undesired attention to his movements and bringing the blacks of the Big Bwana into dangerous intercourse with his own boys. He had told at the bungalow that half his men had deserted. That story might be quickly disproved should his boys and Bwanas grow confidential. The event that he had failed to mention and which now urged him hurriedly after the girl and her escort had occurred during his absence early the preceding evening. His men had been sitting around their campfire, entirely encircled by a high, thorn boma, when, without the slightest warning, a huge lion had leaped amongst them and seized one of their number. It had been solely due to the loyalty and courage of his comrades that his life had been saved, and then only after a battle royal with the hunger-enraged beast had they been able to drive him off with burning brands, spears, and rifles. From this Hansen knew that a man-eater had wandered into the district or been developed by the aging of one of the many lions who ranged the plains and hills by night, or lay up in the cool wood by day. He had heard the roaring of a hungry lion not half an hour before, and there was little doubt in his mind but that the man-eater was stalking Miriam and Baines. He cursed the Englishman for a fool, and spurred rapidly after them. Miriam and Baines had drawn up in a small, natural clearing. 100 yards beyond them Numa lay crouching in the underbrush, his yellow-green eyes fixed upon his prey, the tip of his sinuous tail jerking spasmodically. He was measuring the distance between him and them. He was wondering if he dared venture a charge, or should he wait yet a little longer in the hope that they might ride straight into his jaws. He was very hungry, but also was he very crafty. He could not chance losing his meat by a hasty and ill-considered rush. Had he waited the night before until the blacks slept, he would not have been forced to go hungry for another 24 hours. Behind him the other that had caught his scent and that of man together came to a sitting posture upon the branch of a tree in which he had reposed himself for slumber. Beneath him a lumbering grey hulk swayed to and fro in the darkness. The beast in the tree uttered a low guttural and dropped to the back of the grey mass. He whispered a word in one of the great ears and Tanta, the elephant, raised his trunk aloft, swinging it high and low to catch the scent that the word had warned him of. There was another whispered word, was it a command, and the lumbering beast wheeled into an awkward, yet silent shuffle, in the direction of Numa, the lion, and the stranger Tumangani his rider had scented. Onward they went, the scent of the lion and his prey becoming stronger and stronger. Numa was becoming impatient. How much longer must he wait for his meat to come his way? He lashed his tail viciously now. He almost growled. All unconscious of their danger, the man and the girl sat talking in the little clearing. Their horses were pressed side by side. Baines had found Miriam's hand and was pressing it as he poured words of love into her ear, and Miriam was listening. "Come to London with me," urged the Honourable Morrison. "I can gather a safari and we can be a whole day upon the way to the coast before they guess that we have gone." "Why must we go that way?" asked the girl. "Bwana and my dear would not object to our marriage." "I cannot marry you just yet," explained the Honourable Morrison. "There are some formalities to be attended to first. You do not understand." "It will be all right. We will go to London. I cannot wait. If you love me you will come." "What of the apes you lived with? Did they bother about marriage?" "They love as we love. Had you stayed among them you would have mated as they mate. It is the law of nature, no man-made law can abrogate the laws of God. What difference does it make if we love one another? What do we care for anyone in the world besides ourselves? I would give my life for you, will you give nothing for me?" "You love me," she said. "You will marry me when we have reached London." "I swear it," he cried. "I will go with you," she whispered, "though I do not understand why it is necessary." She leaned toward him and he took her in his arms and bent to press his lips to hers. At the same instant the head of a huge tusker poked through the trees that fringed the clearing. The Honorable Morrison and Miriam, with eyes and ears for one another alone, did not see or hear, but Numa did. The man upon Tanta's broad head saw the girl in the man's arms. It was Korak, but in the trim figure of the neatly garbed girl he did not recognize his Miriam. He only saw a Tarmangani with his she. And then Numa charged. With a frightful roar, fearful lest Tanta had come to frighten away his prey, the great beast leaped from his hiding place. The earth trembled to his mighty voice. The ponies stood for an instant transfixed with terror. The Honorable Morrison Baines went white and cold. The lion was charging toward them full in the brilliant light of the magnificent moon. The muscles of the Honorable Morrison no longer obeyed his will, they flexed to the urge of a greater power, the power of nature's first law. They drove his spurred heels deep into his pony's flanks, they bore the rein against the brute's neck that willed him with an impetuous drive toward the plain and safety. The girl's pony, squealing in terror, reared and plunged upon the heels of his mate. The lion was close upon him. Only the girl was cool, the girl and the half-naked savage who bestrode the neck of his mighty mount and grinned at the exciting spectacle chance had staked for his enjoyment. To Korak here were but two strange Tarmangani pursued by Numa, who was empty. It was Numa's right to prey, but one was a she. Korak felt an intuitive urge to rush to her protection. Why, he could not guess. All Tarmangani were enemies now. He had lived too long a beast to feel strongly the humanitarian impulses that were inherent in him, yet feel them he did, for the girl at least. He urged Tanta forward. He raised his heavy spear and hurled it at the flying target of the lion's body. The girl's pony had reached the trees upon the opposite side of the clearing. Here he would become easy prey to the swiftly moving lion, but Numa, infuriated, preferred the woman upon his back. It was for her he leaped. Korak gave an exclamation of astonishment and approval as Numa landed upon the pony's rump, and at the same instant the girl swung free of her mount to the branches of a tree above her. Korak's spear struck Numa in the shoulder, knocking him from his precarious hold upon the frantically plunging horse. Freed of the weight of both girl and lion, the pony raced ahead toward safety. Numa tore and struck at the missile in his shoulder but could not dislodge it. Then he resumed the chase. Korak guided Tanta into the seclusion of the jungle. He did not wish to be seen, nor had he. Hansen had almost reached the wood when he heard the lion's terrific roars, and knew that the charge had come. An instant later the Honorable Morrison broke upon his vision, racing like mad for safety. The man lay flat upon his pony's back, hugging the animal's neck tightly with both arms and digging the spurs into his sides. An instant later the second pony appeared riderless. Hansen groaned as he guessed what had happened out of sight in the jungle. With an oath he spurred on in the hope of driving the lion from his prey. His rifle was ready in his hand. And then the lion came into view behind the girl's pony. Hansen could not understand. He knew that if Numa had succeeded in seizing the girl he would not have continued in pursuit of the others. He drew in his own mount, took quick aim and fired. The lion stopped in his tracks, turned and bit at his side, then rolled over dead. Hansen rode on into the forest, calling aloud to the girl. "Here I am," came a quick response from the foliage of the trees just ahead. "Did you hit him?" "Yes," replied Hansen. "Where are you?" "You had a mighty narrow escape. It will teach you to keep out of the jungle at night." Together they returned to the plain where they found the Honorable Morrison riding slowly back toward them. He explained that his pony had bolted and that he had had hard work stopping him at all. Hansen grinned, for he recalled the pounding heels that he had seen driving sharp spurs into the flanks of Baines' mount, but he said nothing of what he had seen. He took Miriam up behind him and the three rode in silence toward the bungalow.